Victor Hale drove his horse straight into the middle of Raven Creek's main street and didn't slow down. He pulled up hard in front of the forge, dirt spraying across the boots of every man and woman standing nearby. And he pointed his finger at Caleb Whitmore like he was pointing at a dog. "You think she actually wants you?" Victor's voice carried the full length of the street. "Look at your face, boy. Look at what you are." Caleb said nothing. He never did. But Evelyn did. She walked out of that forge with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and she stopped in the center of that frozen street and looked Victor Hale dead in the eye. And what she said next made a town full of people who had ignored a good man for 11 years finally fall completely, utterly silent. If you've ever been judged for something you couldn't control, stay with us, because this story is for you. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The advertisement was 11 words long. Honest blacksmith, 39. Scarred face. Seeks patient woman. No illusions offered. No illusions offered. Caleb Whitmore had written and rewritten that notice 4 times over 3 evenings, sitting at the small table beside his forge with a candle burning low and a cup of cold coffee he kept forgetting to drink. The first version had been longer, more careful. He'd written things like hardworking and reliable and quiet home in Montana. Safe words. Words that didn't say anything at all. He threw all 4 versions into the fire. The 5th one he kept. He mailed it to a paper in Boston without expecting much. He wasn't sure what he expected, honestly. Maybe nothing. Maybe he'd mailed it the same way a man tosses a coin into a well. Not because he believes anything will happen, but because the silence gets heavy enough that he has to do something just to keep breathing. That was November. By January, he had almost forgotten about it. The town of Raven Creek, Montana, in 1889, was the kind of place that kept its opinions loud and its mercy quiet. It sat at the edge of a wide valley where winters came hard and early, and the wind had a mean streak that locals took personally. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a church, a small schoolhouse, and a post office that also served as the telegraph office, and when necessary, the town's only real gathering point for gossip. Caleb's forge sat at the south end of the main street, which meant everyone who came into town passed by it, and everyone who left passed by it again. He had no choice about being seen. He had simply learned, over the years, to accept being looked at without actually being known. The scar started just below his left eye and swept down across his cheek and jaw, in a ridge of pale, tightened skin that pulled the corner of his mouth into something that looked, if you didn't know him, like a permanent sneer. It wasn't. Caleb Whitmore's natural expression was something closer to careful, watchful, measured, the face of a man who had learned that words cost more than people claimed and that silence was usually safer. He was not a large man exactly, but he was solid in the way that years at a forge made a man solid. Broad shoulders, thick forearms, hands that had been burned and cut and healed so many times they had their own landscape of old damage. He moved deliberately. He didn't rush. He didn't waste motion. He was also, by almost every practical measure, alone. Had been for 11 years. The forge had been his father's. He'd taken it over at 21, after the fire. Before the fire, people in Raven Creek had called him Cal, had invited him to suppers, had expected, in the easy, unspoken way of small towns, that he would eventually marry somebody's daughter and become fully woven into the fabric of the valley. He'd had friends, not many, but real ones. After the fire, the invitation stopped coming. Not all at once. It was gradual, the way these things always are. The way a rope frays one fiber at a time until the day you pull on it and your hand comes up empty. A supper invitation not repeated. A conversation that ended a little sooner than it used to. A man crossing the street to avoid walking past the forge at close range, pretending he'd meant to go that way all along. Caleb noticed all of it. He never said anything about it. He kept working. Margaret Finley, who ran the post office, and therefore knew approximately everything that happened in Raven Creek before it happened to the people it was happening to, was the one who handed him the envelope that January morning. She held it a little longer than necessary before giving it to him, which was her way of communicating that she'd already assessed the situation thoroughly. "That's got a Boston postmark," she said. "I can see that." Eastern paper, fancy envelope, Margaret, I'm just saying. He took the envelope. He didn't open it there, which clearly disappointed her, and he walked back to the forge with it tucked inside his coat against the cold. He didn't open it immediately. He set it on the table and went back to work on a set of hinges he owed Amos Cooper by Friday, and he worked until the morning light came fully through the window and the fire in the forge had settled into its reliable rhythm, and only then did he sit down, pour himself coffee, and open the envelope. The handwriting was neat but not fussy, practiced without being showy. Mr. Whitmore, I am responding to your advertisement in the Eastern Herald. I will not waste your time with false cheerfulness or performed optimism. I am 35 years old, widowed 4 years ago, and I have been managing on very little since my husband's estate proved considerably smaller than he had led me to believe. I am not writing to you because I feel sorry for you. I want that to be clear. I am writing because your notice was the only honest one in the entire column, and I have had enough dishonesty to last several lifetimes. I am not beautiful in the way that stops conversations. I am capable, and I am direct, and I am told I have reasonable humor when things are not too difficult. I can cook, sew, manage accounts, and have been known to repair a fence when the situation required it. I do not expect a fairy tale. I expect two people treating each other with decency. If that interests you, I would appreciate a reply. Evelyn Hartwell, Boston, Massachusetts. Caleb read it twice. Then he set it down, picked up his coffee, stared at the wall for a long moment, and said, to nobody in particular, well. He wrote back the same evening. He wasn't going to. He told himself he wasn't going to. He had a long and practiced relationship with talking himself out of things that might hurt, and this had the shape of something that could hurt considerably. But he sat down after supper with the paper in front of him and found that the words came easier than expected because she hadn't asked him to perform anything. She'd asked him to be straightforward, that he could do. Miss Hartwell, your letter was the clearest thing I've read in years. I'll match it. I'm a blacksmith. I have worked this forge for 18 years, and I intend to work it until I cannot. The town I live in is small, and the winters are serious. I am not an easy man to know, though I am told I am not a cruel one. The scar on my face is from a fire 11 years ago. It is not small, and it is not something that improves with familiarity. It simply is what it is. I mention it because I would rather you know what you are considering. I live alone above the forge. The room I would prepare for you would be your own, with its own door and its own lock if you want it, until such time as we had both decided whether this was something real. I am not interested in pretending. If you have further questions, ask them directly. I will answer them the same way. Caleb Whitmore, Raven Creek, Montana. The letters went back and forth over 8 weeks. Hers were direct and occasionally dry, and once, in the 5th letter, surprisingly funny, she described a mishap with a boarding house cat and a meat pie that made him laugh out loud alone in his kitchen, which startled him because he hadn't heard that sound come out of himself in longer than he could remember. His were shorter. He wasn't naturally a man who filled pages, but he was honest, and she seemed to find that sufficient. By the 8th letter, they had agreed she would come in March. He reread that agreement 3 times, as if checking for errors. The town found out, of course. Margaret Finley estimated it took approximately 4 days after the 2nd letter arrived before the general shape of the situation was understood by most of Raven Creek's adult population. By the 6th letter, it was a confirmed topic of open discussion in both saloons. The opinions were not mixed. They were very specifically in one direction. She doesn't know what he looks like, said Dale Gruber, who operated one of the saloons and had an unfortunate habit of offering assessments nobody requested. She gets off that stagecoach, takes one look, and she's back on it before the horses rest. If she even gets off, said his brother, she'll get off. She just won't stay. This was the common position. There were minor variations. Some people thought she'd stay a week out of politeness, others gave her less. But the central conclusion was unanimous. A woman from Boston, a widow with options, and her faculties about her, was not going to willingly stay in Raven Creek and marry the scarred blacksmith. Caleb heard versions of this talk. He always heard things. The forge was near enough to the main street that sound carried, and men forgot, when they were talking outside, that the forge had a window. He didn't respond to any of it. He built the room instead. The room had been a storage space, filled with extra iron stock and old equipment and 3 years of things he'd kept meaning to sort through and hadn't. He spent 2 weeks clearing it, which involved making decisions he'd been avoiding, which was harder than the physical work. He patched the wall where the plaster had cracked. He built a proper bed frame from good timber, not scrap. He found a rug, worn but clean, at the general store and put it on the floor. He made a small iron hook for the back of the door, neat and functional. He put the wildflowers on the table the morning of the day the stagecoach was due. He stood looking at them for a moment afterward, and then felt suddenly, acutely foolish, and almost took them back off. He left them there. The stagecoach from Billings arrived at 11:30 on a Thursday morning in March, and it seemed like half the town had found reasons to be on the main street when it pulled in. They weren't subtle about it. Women stood in front of the general store with baskets they'd been carrying for an hour. Men who had no business near the post office were near the post office. Dale Gruber was simply standing in the open doorway of his saloon with his arms crossed, not even pretending. Caleb stood apart from all of them, near the edge of the street with his hat in his hands. He was wearing his good shirt, which was not a remarkable shirt but was clean and pressed and the best he had. He'd shaved carefully that morning, which he did every morning, but this morning he'd been more careful than usual around the scar tissue where the skin was uneven and the razor had to be handled differently. He'd cut himself once, a small nick near his jaw, and stood over the wash basin for a moment longer than he needed to, looking at his own face in the piece of mirror he kept above it. He didn't make a habit of looking at himself. He went downstairs and waited. The stagecoach door opened. A woman stepped down. She was not what the town had imagined, which was either more beautiful or more obviously desperate, depending on who was doing the imagining. She was neither. She was medium height, brown-haired, with a practical coat that had been good quality once and had been well taken care of since. She had the posture of someone who had learned to carry her own weight without showing how much it cost her. She looked around the street with clear brown eyes that moved quickly and didn't waver. They found Caleb. She walked toward him. The town held its collective breath. She stopped 3 feet away and she looked at his face, not quickly, not with the flinching sideways glance he had learned to recognize and brace for. She looked directly, with the focused attention of someone reading something they actually want to understand. Then she said, "Mr. Whitmore." "Miss Hartwell." "You're taller than I expected." He looked at her for a moment. "You're calmer than I expected." Something moved across her face that was close to a smile but hadn't quite arrived yet. She put out her hand. He shook it. Behind them, Dale Gruber uncrossed his arms. Margaret Finley, watching from the post office window, put her hand over her mouth. The stagecoach driver, who had seen a great many things in 30 years of running routes across Montana, looked down from his seat and thought, though he would not have said this out loud to anyone, that he had just watched something important happen, though he couldn't have named exactly what it was. Caleb picked up her bag. "The forge is this way," he said. "Lead on," she said. And they walked together down the main street of Raven Creek, Montana, past every watching eye, in the cold, bright air of a March morning, while the town tried to figure out what, exactly, it was going to do with what it had just witnessed. What? The first evening was awkward in the specific, particular way that two honest people who don't yet know each other are awkward. Not hostile, not falsely warm, just careful. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and ate the supper Caleb had made, which was a beef stew that was competent if not inspired, and asked him straightforward questions about the forge and the town and the winters, and he answered them with equal straightforwardness, and neither of them performed anything at all. At one point she asked him how long he'd been running the business alone. He told her 18 years. She said, "That's a long time to keep a thing going by yourself." He looked at his bowl. "It is what it is." She nodded and didn't push and went back to her stew. Later, he showed her the room. She stood in the doorway looking at it. The bed frame, the rug, the small iron hook on the door. She saw the wildflowers on the table. She was quiet for a moment. "You made the hook," she said. "It's a simple piece." "It's a good one." He said nothing. He was standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the careful, neutral expression he wore in public, except that something in it had shifted slightly, the way the surface of still water shifts when something moves just below it. She turned and looked at him directly. "Thank you," she said, "for the room, for all of it." He nodded once. "Get some rest," he said. "It's cold by morning." He pulled the door shut. He stood in the hallway outside it for several seconds before he went back downstairs. In the 3 weeks that followed, the town watched carefully and found very little to report, which frustrated many of them considerably. Evelyn walked the main street. She introduced herself to people without waiting to be introduced. She went to the general store and spoke with Catherine Walsh, the owner's wife, about the price of flour and the quality of the winter root vegetables, with the focused practicality of a woman who had spent years managing on too little and knew exactly what she was doing. She was not what they'd expected. They'd expected either heartbreak or performance. Instead, they got a woman who shook hands firmly and made eye contact and seemed, bewilderingly, to be fine. More than fine. She was seen, on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks in, walking back from the edge of town beside Caleb, and she was talking, and he was listening in the focused way he listened to things that actually mattered to him. And then he said something back, low enough that nobody could hear it, and she laughed. She laughed. Margaret Finley watched this from the post office window and felt something she couldn't quite name, which was unusual for her, and wrote a letter to her sister in Billings that evening that went on longer than she intended. The girl arrived on a Wednesday. Lucy Dawson was 7 years old and small for her age, and had been living with her uncle and aunt since her parents died the previous spring. Her uncle was a decent enough man when he was sober and a difficult one when he wasn't, and Lucy had learned to fill her afternoons away from the house when the mood in it got unpredictable. She'd been coming to the forge for almost a year before Evelyn arrived. She knocked on the open door frame with her small fist and said, "Mr. Caleb?" Caleb looked up from the piece he was working. "Your hands are clean?" he said. She showed him. He looked at them with the seriousness he gave most things, and then nodded once. "Come in." Evelyn was in the kitchen and heard the exchange. She came to the doorway between the kitchen and the forge and stood there watching. The girl came in, saw Evelyn, and stopped. "Who are you?" Lucy said, with the unguarded directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to soften questions. "Evelyn," she said, "I married Mr. Whitmore." Lucy turned and looked at Caleb with an expression of profound assessment. "She's nice?" Lucy asked him. "Yes," Caleb said, without looking up from his work. Lucy turned back to Evelyn and appeared to conclude the matter settled. "He makes animals," Lucy said. "From iron. Do you want to see?" "Very much," Evelyn said. Caleb set down his hammer. He reached to a shelf at the back of the forge, a shelf Evelyn hadn't noticed before, set back in the shadows, and brought down a small iron horse no bigger than a fist. He set it on the workbench in front of Lucy. The girl touched it with one finger, the way she always did, as if confirming it was real. Evelyn looked at the horse, then she looked at Caleb. I was watching Lucy with an expression she had not seen on his face before, unguarded, quiet, something that didn't have much armor around it at all. She looked back at the horse. She didn't say anything. Some things, she had learned, were better received without commentary. That night, after Lucy had gone home and the forge was banked for the evening, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and Caleb came in and poured himself water from the pitcher and stood at the other end of the kitchen, and she said, without turning around, "How many of those has she got?" A pause. "A horse," he said. "A dog. I'm making a bird." She was quiet for a moment. "Does she know," Evelyn said carefully, "about her parents?" "She knows they're gone." Another pause. "She doesn't talk about it." "And the uncle?" Caleb set down his cup. His voice, when he answered, was very even. "He's not a bad man," he said. "He's just not a strong one." Evelyn turned and looked at him. He was looking at the table. "You keep an eye on her," she said. It wasn't a question. "She's 7 years old," he said, as if that explained everything. It did. 3 weeks after that conversation, Caleb came in from the forge at midday to find that Evelyn had rearranged the kitchen. Not dramatically. She hadn't moved the furniture or changed where things lived in any fundamental way. But the shelf above the hearth, where he'd kept 3 mismatched plates and a cracked cup he kept meaning to replace, now held 4 matching cups. Nothing fancy, plainware from the general store. And the table had been moved 2 inches toward the window, which let in slightly more light at noon, and there was a cloth on the table that hadn't been there before. A plain one, blue-gray, worn but clean. He stood looking at it. She came out of the back room with a pile of mending and saw him standing there, and she stopped. "If it bothers you," she said, "it can go back." He looked at the cloth for another moment. "It doesn't bother me," he said. "Good." She sat down and picked up the mending. He poured himself coffee and sat at the other side of the table, and they sat there together in the thin noon light with her sewing and him drinking his coffee, and neither of them felt the need to say anything, and that silence was different from the silence he had been living in for 11 years. It had different weight to it, different temperature, and Caleb sat in it carefully, the way a man sits in an unfamiliar chair, not sure yet how much weight it will bear, but surprised, so far, to find it holding. The letter arrived on a Thursday in the last week of March. He almost didn't open it because it came from Victor Hale's ranch, and letters from Victor Hale were never letters that made a man's day better. But business was business, and he opened it. Victor Hale needed the iron fittings on his 2 largest supply wagons repaired before the spring drive. He was sending the wagons in on Friday. He expected a price. Caleb wrote back a price. It was fair, not cheap. He'd stopped being cheap years ago when he'd realized that being cheap was a thing that men without options did, and that he had options even if the town didn't always treat him like he did. Victor Hale's reply came back the following day. It was 2 lines. That price is robbery. I'll give you half. If you don't like it, I'll find another smith. The nearest other smith was in a town 40 miles east, and Victor Hale knew that. Caleb held the letter for a moment. Then he folded it neatly and put it in his pocket and went back to work. He did not reply. Not yet. He told Evelyn about it that evening. He wasn't sure why he did. He'd been handling Victor Hale's particular kind of bad faith for years, alone and without anyone to tell, and he could have continued to do so. But she was across the table from him, and the habit of conversation had been building quietly over 8 weeks, and he told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "And what are you going to do?" "Tell him the price stands. He pays it, or he doesn't. And if he doesn't, then his wagons go unrepaired." She looked at him for a moment. "Will he push back?" Caleb said nothing for a beat. "Victor Hale has been pushing back since I was 24 years old. He doesn't need a reason. He needs an audience." Something moved through Evelyn's expression. Not quite anger, something more deliberate than that. "Then you hold the price," she said. "I intend to." "Good." She picked up mending again. He watched her hands work for a moment. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had not expected this. This particular quality of being heard without being handled, of being agreed with without being managed. He wasn't sure he had a word for it yet. He drank his coffee. Outside, the March wind pushed at the window, and inside the forge kitchen with the blue-gray cloth on the table and the 4 matching cups on the shelf, Caleb Whitmore sat across from his wife and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not exactly happiness, but was in the same neighborhood of it. He wasn't sure what to do with that yet. He left it alone, the way you leave something fragile alone until you understand it better. But he didn't throw it away. The wagons came on a Friday, as promised. 2 heavy supply wagons, both of them showing the kind of wear that came from hard use and harder winters. The iron fittings on the wheel hubs cracked along stress lines that Caleb could see from 20 feet away. Victor Hale didn't bring them himself. He sent a ranch hand named Roy, a thin young man in his early 20s who clearly wanted nothing to do with whatever arrangement had brought him here, and who handed Caleb a folded note without making eye contact. The note restated the offer, half price. Take it or leave it. Caleb read it, folded it back along its crease, and handed it to Roy. "Tell him the price stands," Caleb said. Roy looked genuinely pained. "Mr. Hale's not going to like that." "I expect not." "He's going to say, 'Roy.'" Caleb's voice wasn't harsh. It was simply final. "Tell him what I said." Roy left with the wagon still sitting in front of the forge, which was not ideal for anyone, including Caleb, because 2 supply wagons parked across his entrance were a practical obstacle, and also a declaration, and the town noticed both things simultaneously. By mid-afternoon, the wagons were a conversation topic at the general store. By evening, they were a conversation topic at both saloons. Dale Gruber, who had an extraordinary talent for locating the inflammable center of any situation, told 3 separate people that evening that Caleb Whitmore had finally gotten too big for himself, and that Victor Hale was the kind of man who didn't forget a slight, and that this was going to end badly, and wasn't it a shame that the new wife had arrived just in time to see it? None of the 3 people he told disagreed with him. Well, Evelyn found out about the wagons when she walked back from the general store that afternoon and nearly walked into one of them. She stood and looked at them for a moment. Then she went inside and found Caleb at the forge, working steadily on a different job. A set of plow fittings for the Anderson farm that had nothing to do with Victor Hale and everything to do with the fact that Caleb Whitmore did not stop working simply because someone was trying to make him uncomfortable. "Those are Hale's wagons," she said. "Yes." "He sent them without agreeing to the price?" "He sent them assuming I'd give in when I saw them sitting there." She looked at him. "Will you?" He glanced up briefly from the fitting he was working. "No." She put down her basket and took off her coat. "All right," she said, and went into the kitchen to start supper. He watched her go. He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to say. Something cautionary, maybe. Something about not making powerful enemies or about the practical realities of small-town commerce. His father had been a pragmatic man who'd believed that a craftsman's survival depended on never antagonizing the men with money, and Caleb had spent 30 years arguing with that philosophy internally without ever quite winning the argument. Evelyn had said all right and gone to make supper. He went back to the plow fitting. The wagons sat outside until Saturday morning, when Roy came back and retrieved them without a word, and Caleb watched them go from the window above the forge and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has held a position and found it still standing. It was a small victory. He didn't trust it. Men like Victor Hale didn't absorb a refusal. They redirected it. Lucy came on Saturday afternoon. She knocked, showed her hands, came in, and immediately noticed that Evelyn had rearranged the small shelf where Caleb kept his tools, organizing them by size and function, rather than by the comfortable chaos he'd lived with for 18 years. "She moved your things," Lucy said, with the gravity of a child reporting a serious development. "She organized them," Caleb said. "Is that the same?" "In this case." Lucy thought about this for a moment, then apparently decided it was not her concern, and climbed up on the stool beside the workbench that had been there for the past year, positioned at exactly the right height for a 7-year-old to watch without being underfoot. Caleb was working on the bird. It was slow work. Iron didn't naturally want to become something delicate, and forcing it into the shape of wings without losing the sense of lightness that made a bird. A bird required a kind of attention that was different from the attention he gave to practical ironwork. With practical pieces, he was thinking about function, about stress points, and load-bearing and the marriage of form to purpose. With the bird, he was thinking about something harder to name. Lucy watched him in silence for a while, which was one of the things he appreciated about her. She wasn't a child who needed constant noise. "Mr. Caleb," she said eventually. "Does it hurt, your face?" He didn't stop working. "Not anymore." "Did it hurt before?" "For a while." She was quiet again. Then, "My knee hurt for a long time after I fell off the fence last summer, but then it didn't." "That's how it works, usually." She nodded, satisfied with this answer in the way children are satisfied when an adult speaks to them like their question was a real one. Evelyn came to the doorway. She had flour on her hands and a look on her face that said she'd been baking something and it had not gone entirely according to plan. "Lucy," she said, "do you want to help me figure out why this bread is determined to be terrible?" Lucy looked at Caleb. He made a small gesture toward the kitchen with his chin. Lucy slid off the stool and went. He listened to them in the kitchen, the girl's voice asking questions, Evelyn answering them with the same straightforward patience she gave most things. And he kept working on the bird, and he thought, not for the first time and not comfortably, about what Victor Hale's next move would look like. It came on a Tuesday, and it came through Margaret Finley. Not through Margaret directly, she would not have been a willing participant. It came through the simple mechanism of a small town's information flow, which was that Victor Hale had told 3 men at Dale Gruber's saloon on Monday evening that Caleb Whitmore had been running a dishonest business for years, that his prices were extortion, that the only reason people in Raven Creek used him was because he was the only smith in 40 miles and he knew it, and that any man who actually had a choice would choose differently. By Tuesday morning, Catherine Walsh at the general store had heard it. By Tuesday noon, Evelyn had heard it, from Catherine Walsh, in the careful, apologetic way that people deliver information they know will cause pain but can't bring themselves to withhold. She came home and didn't say anything immediately. She made lunch, she set it on the table, she sat down and ate. Caleb came in from the forge, washed his hands, sat down, and looked at her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He listened without changing expression, which was something he'd practiced without meaning to over 11 years of absorbing bad news in public. When she finished, he reached for his coffee. "That's not new," he said. "Victor Hale has been saying versions of that for a long time." To three men in a saloon, yes. This time, it's moving. She looked at him steadily. "Catherine said the Andersons came in this morning asking if she'd heard any complaints about your work." That landed differently than the rest of it. The Andersons had been coming to him for 8 years. Their farm ran on his ironwork, plows, wheel fittings, gate hardware, a dozen smaller pieces a year. They were not wealthy, but they were consistent, and they were decent people, and their plow fittings were sitting half-finished in his forge right now. He set down the coffee. "The Andersons," he said. "I told Catherine she should tell them she had heard nothing of the kind. I don't know if she did." He looked at the table. "Caleb?" Her voice was careful but not soft. "He's trying to pull your foundation out from under you." "I know what he's trying to do." "Then what are you going to do about it?" He didn't answer right away. The honest answer was that he didn't know, and that not knowing was a familiar and unwelcome sensation, the feeling of a problem that couldn't be solved with his hands, with iron and fire, and the reliable physics of the forge. Victor Hale wasn't a cracked fitting. He was a man with money and a grudge and a talent for making other people carry his anger for him. "I'm going to finish the Anderson fittings," he said finally, "and deliver them, and let the work speak." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "That's your plan?" "It's what I have." She was quiet. Then she said, "It's not enough." He looked up. "Caleb, I have watched you for 8 weeks. You are a man who believes that if he keeps his head down and does good work, eventually people will recognize it." She wasn't angry. She was matter-of-fact in the way that was sometimes harder to receive than anger. "That is a fine thing to believe. But Victor Hale is not interested in recognizing your work. He is interested in making you smaller than him, and the way he does that is by making other people see you the way he wants them to." He said nothing. "The work is not enough on its own," she said. "Not against that." He looked at his hands on the table, the scarred, thick-knuckled hands of 18 years at a forge, hands that had built most of the functional hardware in this valley, hands that had fixed what was broken for people who then crossed the street to avoid walking too close to the man those hands belonged to. "I don't know what else to offer," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said out loud in a long time, and it cost him something to say it. She didn't rush to fill the silence. After a moment, she said, "You don't have to offer anything. You just have to stop assuming the truth will find its own way out." She picked up her fork. "It won't. Someone has to carry it." He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The Andersons came to collect the fittings on Thursday. Eric Anderson was a large, quiet Scandinavian man who communicated primarily through the deliberate movement of his body. A nod that meant yes, a specific way of standing that meant he was listening, a different way of standing that meant he was done. His wife, Britta, was his functional opposite, small, fast-talking, with the bright eyes of a woman who missed nothing. They came together, which was unusual. Eric usually came alone. Caleb met them at the door of the forge. There was a moment, brief but present, where Eric looked at him with something in his face that was measuring rather than greeting, and Caleb recognized it immediately. He'd been looked at that way before. It was the look of a man who has heard something and is checking it against what he already knows. Caleb let him look. He brought out the fittings and laid them on the workbench. He walked Eric through each piece, where the stress had been, what he'd done to correct it, what would need watching in the next season. He spoke plainly and specifically, the way he always did when he was talking about work he understood completely. Eric picked up the main plow fitting and turned it in his hands. He looked at the weld. He set it down. "Good work," Eric said. It was all he said, but the measuring quality had left his face. Britta, who had been standing slightly behind her husband in a way that suggested she was prepared to take over if necessary, relaxed incrementally. "We heard some talk," she said, because Britta Anderson was not a woman who left things unaddressed. "From Gruber's." "I expect you did," Caleb said. "Victor Hale's not a man to let a thing go." "No." She looked at him directly. "I want you to know that Eric and I have been bringing our work to you for 8 years, and we have never once had cause to complain." "I appreciate that." "I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because it's true. And because I think you should know that not everyone in this town is going to let Victor Hale make their decisions for them." Caleb looked at her. He thought about what Evelyn had said. Someone has to carry it. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson," he said, and meant it more than the words could carry. That evening, he told Evelyn about the Andersons. She listened, and when he finished, she nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed rather than resolved. "That's 2 people," she said. 2 is better than none." "It is?" She looked at him. "And the rest of them?" "The rest of them will decide for themselves." She accepted this without agreeing with it, which was a distinction he had learned to read in her over the past weeks. Evelyn did not always argue with positions she disagreed with. Sometimes she simply let them sit in the open air, where they had to survive on their own merits. He was still thinking about this when he went back to the forge that night, later than usual, to finish a piece he'd been putting off. The town was quiet. The street outside was empty. The fire in the forge caught and settled into its rhythm, and he worked by its light the way he'd worked alone by its light for 11 years, except that the room above him wasn't empty, and that was different. He caught himself listening, without meaning to, for any sound from upstairs. He heard nothing. She was asleep, most likely, which was reasonable. It was past 10. But he was aware of the occupied room above him in a way that was new and not unpleasant, and slightly alarming, because it meant something was changing in the internal architecture of a life he had built carefully around absence, and he wasn't certain he knew where it was going. He went back to the piece in his hands and tried to focus on the iron. April came in cold and then warmed suddenly, the way Montana springs did. Not gradually, not with any particular grace, but as if the season had finally decided to stop arguing about it. The valley turned green in a week. The road into town, which had been a frozen track all winter, became first mud, and then something that almost deserved to be called a road again. With the thaw came more work. Spring was always the busiest season at the forge. Everything that had broken over winter and been set aside to deal with later arrived all at once, and Caleb was putting in long days that started before light and ended after dark. Evelyn adjusted without being asked. She moved supper back an hour. She took over the ordering of supplies from the general store, which she did with a system Caleb hadn't had. A running list, kept in a small book, with quantities and dates and prices noted in the precise handwriting he'd come to recognize as distinctly hers. She fixed a leak in the roof above the back room that he'd been meaning to fix since October, patching it herself with materials from the general store, and a method she explained afterward as having been learned from a necessity at the boarding house in Boston, where even the landlord's repairs needed repairing. He came in from the forge one evening and found her up on a chair with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and she climbed down and showed him the patch, and it was better than what he would have done. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "When you can't pay someone, you learn," she said, and went to wash her hands. He stood looking at the patch for a moment. It was a good patch. It was a Wednesday in the second week of April when Lucy didn't come. This, by itself, was not alarming. The girl had a life outside the forge, school, her aunt's household demands, the particular obligations of a 7-year-old that couldn't always be anticipated. But she'd been coming reliably on Wednesdays for nearly a year, and by 4 in the afternoon, when the afternoon light had shifted and the usual hour had come and gone, Caleb found himself glancing at the door more than was productive. Evelyn noticed. She didn't say anything until 5 when she put on her coat. "I'm going to walk past the Dawson house," she said. "You don't need to. I know I don't need to." She was already buttoning. "I want to." He started to say something else and stopped. She was looking at him with the particular expression she got when she had made a decision and was being patient about the fact that he hadn't caught up yet. He went back to the piece he was working. She came back 40 minutes later, and he knew from the way she came through the door, deliberate, controlled, with something moving underneath the control, that it hadn't been a good 40 minutes. "She's fine," Evelyn said first, because she understood him well enough by now to know that was what he needed to hear. "She's at home." "What happened?" Evelyn took off her coat and hung it up. She stood with her back to him for a moment before she turned around. "Her uncle came home early," she said. "He wasn't—" She said he was angry, shouting. Caleb set down his hammer. "Was she hurt?" "No, frightened, I think. Her aunt was there. It was—" She stopped, choosing her words. "It was not a physical thing, but it was not a good situation. He stood very still. "She's all right," Evelyn said again. "I spoke with her aunt. The aunt seems—" Another pause. "She seems to be doing the best she can. And the uncle?" "Had gone out by the time I arrived. He picked up the hammer again, but he didn't go back to the work. He stood holding it and looked at the wall. She shouldn't have to go home to that," he said. "No, she shouldn't." He set the hammer down again. "There's not much I can do about it." "No," Evelyn agreed. "There isn't. Not directly." He heard the "not directly" and knew she was thinking something through. But he didn't push. He'd learned that about her too. That her brain worked a few steps ahead of her words, and that interrupting the process didn't speed it up. Lucy appeared the following morning before school and knocked the usual knock. She came in and showed her hands, climbed up on the stool, and sat in silence for a few minutes while Caleb worked. Her face was fine. Nothing outwardly wrong. But she was quieter than usual, with the specific quality of quiet that children have when they are carrying something heavy and have decided not to set it down. After a while, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't come yesterday." "It's all right," Caleb said. "Uncle had a bad day." "That happens." She looked at the bird, which was nearly finished now, sitting on the edge of the workbench with its wings at the angle he'd finally gotten right after 3 attempts. "Is the bird done?" "Almost." She considered it. "It looks like it's about to go somewhere." He looked at it. She was right, actually. He hadn't thought of it that way, but that was exactly what it looked like. A bird a half-second before liftoff, caught in iron at the precise moment of deciding. "That's what birds do," he said. She nodded seriously. He reached for a file to smooth the last edge of the tail feather and worked in silence for a while, and she watched, and neither of them mentioned the day before again. The real trouble announced itself on a Saturday in late April, the way real trouble often did in Raven Creek, publicly, with an audience, in a manner designed to make retreat as difficult as possible. Victor Hale came himself this time. He rode into town in the mid-morning, which was not unusual. He came in most Saturdays for supplies and to conduct whatever business he conducted, which usually involved reminding people in various indirect ways that he was a significant landowner in this valley, and that significance had implications. He tied his horse in front of the general store and went in, and came out, and then walked the main street with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided the street belongs to him. He stopped in front of the forge. Caleb was visible through the open door, working. Victor stood outside for a moment, not doing anything, just standing, which was itself a kind of statement. And then he walked in without knocking, which nobody with any sense did at a working forge, and he stood with his thumbs in his belt and looked around as if he were assessing the value of the building for a potential purchase. "Whitmore," he said. Caleb didn't look up. "Hale." "I've been thinking about our business." "Have you?" "I think you made an error in your pricing." Now Caleb looked up. He set down the piece he was working and straightened and looked at Victor Hale directly, which was something many people in Raven Creek avoided doing because Victor Hale was a large man with pale eyes and the specific self-assurance of someone who had never once in his life encountered a consequence he couldn't manage. "I was 52 years old and had been the largest landowner in this part of Montana for 20 years. And he wore that position the way some men wore expensive coats. Not for warmth, but for the effect. "The price was fair," Caleb said. "The price was high." "The price was fair." Victor's expression shifted slightly. Not into anger, not yet. Into something more calculated. "I've been telling people," he said, almost conversationally, "that your prices have gotten difficult." "I know." A small pause. "Does that bother you?" Caleb looked at him steadily. "What you tell people is your business." "It is." Victor nodded slowly. "It is indeed. And what you charge people is your business. And whether people decide they'd rather take their work 40 miles east, well," he spread his hands, "that's their business." "It is." Victor looked at him for a moment. His eyes moved briefly to the scarred side of Caleb's face. Not a glance, a deliberate look, the kind that was meant to be noticed. "You know, some folks in this town have been good to you, more patient than most men would be." "Patient," Caleb said, and something in his voice changed fractionally, not in volume, but in texture, and Victor heard it because Victor was good at reading rooms. "Given the circumstances," Victor said, "given what—" He made a gesture that encompassed, vaguely, the left side of Caleb's face. A long silence. Caleb said, "You have my price. You can pay it or not." "I think I'm working." Caleb picked up his piece. "Shut the door on your way out." Victor Hale went very still. Nobody spoke to him that way. Practically nobody in Raven Creek was in a position to, and those who might have the standing to do it had long since found more diplomatic arrangements with the largest landowner in the valley. Victor Hale was a man whose money made other people's manners very reliable. He looked at Caleb for a long moment. Caleb, who had already gone back to his work, who had his eyes on the iron in his hands and his back carrying the particular set of a man who has said what he came to say and is done. Victor walked out. The door did not quite slam, but it was not a gentle close. Evelyn heard it from the kitchen. She didn't know the specifics, she hadn't heard the words, but she heard the quality of the silence that followed the door, and she came to the doorway between the kitchen and the forge. Caleb was working. "Victor Hale?" she said. "Yes." "What did he want?" Caleb told her, briefly and accurately, without editorializing. Evelyn listened. She said nothing for a moment. "He's not done," she said. "No." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" He considered the question with more honesty than he usually gave it. "I'm fine," he said. Then, because she had earned more than the automatic answer, "He does something to the room when he says things like that. About the—" He stopped. She waited. "About the face," he said. She held his gaze. "I know. It's not— I don't care exactly. I've heard it for 11 years. He was looking at the piece in his hands. "But it still does something to the room." "Yes," she said quietly. "It would." He looked up. She was watching him with the steady, undecorated attention she gave to things that mattered, and there was nothing in her face that he had to brace against. No pity, no performative reassurance, no careful management of his feelings. Just the simple acknowledgement that what he'd said was true. He didn't have a word for what that was worth. He went back to the iron. She went back to the kitchen. 3 days later, Evelyn went to see Margaret Finley. She brought no particular pretext, no letters to mail, no packages to collect. She simply walked in and sat down across from Margaret's counter and said, "Tell me about the fire." Margaret Finley blinked. She had been the postmistress of Raven Creek for 22 years. She had processed the information of the town through every iteration, and she could read the purpose behind a question better than almost anyone in the valley. She looked at Evelyn Whitmore, who had been Evelyn Hartwell until 8 weeks ago, and understood immediately and exactly why she was being asked. "Sit down properly," Margaret said. "I'll make coffee." She made it herself, which she rarely did for anyone, and she sat across from Evelyn and she told her. The fire had been in the barn of a man named Hollis Webb, whose property sat a mile from town. 11 years ago, a Wednesday in October, the hay had caught. A lamp, most people thought, or a spark from a cooking fire. It was never fully established. The fire moved fast. There had been 2 men still inside, Webb's farmhand and a young stable boy, 14 years old, who worked weekends and had been doing an extra shift. Caleb had been passing on the road. He'd gone in twice. He got the stable boy out on the first pass. He went back for the farmhand and got him as far as the door before the roof came down on the left side. Both men lived. Caleb spent 3 months after that in a recovery that Margaret described simply as very bad, with the understated brevity of someone who had watched it and didn't enjoy the memory. "He never talked about it after," Margaret said. At the beginning, people tried to make something of it, but he shut that down. Wouldn't be called a hero, wouldn't discuss it." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "And then, gradually, people just started seeing the scar and forgetting what it was from." Evelyn sat very still. "Forgetting," she said. "It's easier," Margaret said, without pride. "Easier to see a man as his damage than to remember the thing that caused it." Evelyn looked at the counter for a moment. "Does he know that people have forgotten?" Margaret Finley was quiet for a long moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that he believes they never particularly cared to remember." Evelyn nodded once. She picked up her coffee and finished it. She thanked Margaret, who was not a woman who usually needed thanking, and walked back to the forge in the late April morning light, and she did not tell Caleb where she'd been or what she'd learned. Not yet. She was still thinking about it 4 days later when Victor Hale came back. This time he brought an audience. It was a Saturday. The main street busy with the week's business, people coming and going from the general store and the post office and the feed supply. The particular Saturday density of a small town that conducts most of its commercial life once a week. Victor Hale came down the center of the street on his horse, which he always rode in a way that made you aware of the horse, and he stopped in front of the forge. Caleb was outside, moving a piece of iron that had come in from the Hendersons' farm, a large gate that had been twisted off its post in a winter storm. He saw Victor, and he saw the people watching, and he set the gate section down and waited. Victor stayed on his horse. "I've decided I'm not paying your price," Victor said. It was loud enough to carry to the people on both sides of the street. Not shouted, he was too sophisticated for that, but projected, performed. "That's your right," Caleb said. "I've also decided that I'm going to be advising my men and my neighbors to take their business east. 40 miles isn't so far." He looked down at Caleb from the height of the horse. A man who can't deal fairly doesn't deserve what he has. Some part of Caleb knew that the technically correct thing, the strategic thing, was to say nothing, to let it go, to wait him out. He had let it go for years. This particular kind of thing had stood in public spaces and absorbed what men like Victor said, and then gone back to his forge and worked it off in iron and fire. But there was something different this morning. Maybe it was 8 weeks of someone sleeping in the room above the forge. Maybe it was the blue-gray cloth on the table and 4 matching cups on the shelf, and a woman who asked him direct questions and waited for real answers. Maybe it was simply that the particular piece of ground he was standing on felt, for the first time, like his to stand on. "My price is fair," Caleb said, and his voice was clear and level. "I have been charging fair prices at this forge for 18 years. Every man on this street knows it." A silence. Victor's pale eyes moved across the left side of his face with the deliberate attention of a man using a tool. "You've had a fair amount of patience from this town," he said, "given everything." "I have done work for this town," Caleb said. "I don't ask patience. I ask what the job is worth." "Some jobs," Victor paused, with the timing of a man who knows he has an audience. "Some jobs are worth more when the man doing them is someone people want to look at." It landed exactly the way it was meant to. Caleb heard someone on the boardwalk draw breath. He said nothing for a moment. And then, before he could decide whether he had anything left to say, he heard footsteps behind him, and Evelyn came out of the forge. She had been working inside. She was still wearing her work apron, and she had a smear of something on her sleeve, and her hair had come partly loose from its pins. And she walked past Caleb and stopped at the edge of the street and looked up at Victor Hale the way she'd looked at his advertisement in that Boston paper 8 weeks ago. Directly, with the focused attention of someone reading something they want to understand. "Mr. Hale," she said. Victor looked at her. His expression shifted into something that was almost courtesy. He was, in most practical ways, a man of his time, and women of a certain bearing generated automatic if shallow deference. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly," Evelyn said, and her voice was carrying now the way his had been carrying. "You are a man who needs iron work done. My husband has offered you a fair price. You don't want to pay a fair price, so you have come here, on a busy Saturday morning, in front of everyone in this town, to suggest that my husband should charge you less because of the way his face looks." A beat. "Is that correct?" Victor's jaw tightened. "That's not what I—" "Because if that's what you mean, I'd like you to say it plainly." Her voice didn't waver. "Say it plainly, in front of these people, and let them hear it." The street was very quiet. Victor looked down at her from the horse. He was accustomed to the kind of women who softened things, who approached men like him with the angled diplomacy of people who understood the practical power of his money and his land. Evelyn Whitmore was looking at him the way you look at a thing you have already decided about. "This is between me and your husband," he said. "My husband has already answered you. I'm speaking for myself." She didn't move. "The man you're standing in front of has been putting iron into this valley for 18 years. He has fixed your equipment before today. He has done it well. The price he named is a fair price, and you and I and everyone on this street know it." She paused. "The scar on his face is from a fire 11 years ago. He went into that fire twice. Hollis Webb's stable boy is 25 years old today because of it. Samuel Greer's arm works because of it." She had not looked at Caleb while she spoke. She was looking at Victor Hale. But around her, on the boardwalks on both sides of the street, she could hear the town recalibrating. So I'll ask you again, Mr. Hale, is your objection to his price or to his face? Victor Hale sat on his horse for a very long moment. The morning was cold and bright and still, and every person on the main street of Raven Creek was looking at him, waiting. He turned his horse. He rode back the way he came. He didn't answer, but the street had heard the question, and the question was its own kind of answer. And as Evelyn turned back toward the forge, her hands steady and her chin level and her sleeves still smeared from the work she'd left inside, Caleb Whitmore was standing exactly where she'd walked past him, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. She couldn't fully name it. It was somewhere between something that had cracked open and something that had found a place to stand. She walked back past him and through the door of the forge. "The gate won't move itself," she said, and went back inside to work. He stood in the street for a moment longer, then he picked up the gate section and carried it inside. Nobody talked about it directly. That was not the Raven Creek way. What happened instead was more subtle and, in its own fashion, more thorough. The day after Evelyn stood in the middle of the main street and asked Victor Hale his question out loud, the question he hadn't answered, the town began a quiet and largely unspoken process of reassessment. Not an apology. Nothing so clean as that. More like the slow turning of a large thing that had been facing one direction for a long time and was now, with considerable reluctance and some discomfort, facing another. Caleb noticed it first in the way men greeted him. For 11 years, the greeting he received most often on the main street of Raven Creek was a nod. The minimal acknowledgement that said, "I see you and I am meeting the social requirement of seeing you, and now we are both free to move on." It was not unfriendly. It was not friendly. It was the precisely calibrated gesture of a town that had decided, without ever holding a formal vote on the matter, that the scarred blacksmith was something to be managed rather than known. The Tuesday after Evelyn's confrontation with Victor Hale, Thomas Brody, who ran the feed supply and had been nodding at Caleb for 6 years without adding words to it, said good morning. 2 words. Caleb said good morning back. Brody nodded and kept walking, and that was the entirety of the exchange, but Caleb stood in the street for a half-second longer than necessary afterward, because 2 words were different from no words, and he knew it, and it made him feel something he didn't entirely know what to do with. He went back to the forge and didn't mention it to Evelyn. He didn't mention it because he wasn't sure how to explain why it mattered so much, and he was wary of anything that mattered too much, because things that mattered too much had a tendency to go away and leave a specific kind of damage behind them. Evelyn, for her part, was not watching for signs of the town's changing opinion. She was watching Lucy. The girl had been coming to the forge every Wednesday and most Saturday mornings for 3 weeks now, since the incident with the uncle, and there was a pattern to it that Evelyn had been quietly tracking. Lucy arrived at the forge in good spirits or bad spirits, depending on what the previous evening had been like at the Dawson house, and you could tell the difference without asking. On good days, she climbed the stool and talked from the moment she sat down. On bad days, she climbed the stool and sat quietly for the first half hour, as if she needed to be somewhere safe before she could start being herself again. Evelyn understood this. She had spent years in Boston being in rooms that didn't feel safe enough to be herself in, and she recognized the posture of a person who was waiting for the room to prove itself trustworthy before relaxing their shoulders. On a Wednesday in early May, Lucy arrived with a bruise on her forearm. It was not, in itself, a dramatic bruise. Children fell. Children ran into things. A bruise on a 7-year-old's arm was not automatically a story, but it was on the inside of the forearm, and it was the shape of a hand, and Evelyn saw it when Lucy reached for the small iron bird, which Caleb had finished and presented to her on the previous Saturday with the same solemnity he gave to major transactions, and which Lucy now carried in her coat pocket and produced at the forge the way other children produced favorite stones or special sticks. Evelyn saw the bruise and she did not react immediately, which cost her something, because her immediate reaction was the kind that didn't help anyone. She waited until Caleb had gone to the back of the forge for materials, and then she sat down beside Lucy on the bench, not across from her, beside her, which was a different geometry entirely. And she said, "Can I ask you something?" Lucy looked at her. "Okay." "Does your arm hurt?" A pause. "It's fine." "Okay." Evelyn didn't look at the bruise. She looked at her own hands folded in her lap. I had a landlady in Boston once who had a very small kitchen, very easy to bump into things in a small kitchen. Lucy said nothing. I was always getting bruises in that kitchen, Evelyn said conversationally. It was a nuisance. After a moment, Lucy said, Uncle was having a bad night, very quietly. Evelyn nodded. I see. He didn't mean it. I know. Aunt Ruth said he didn't mean it. I believe you. She looked at Lucy now, and her voice stayed even. Does this happen often? Lucy looked at the bird in her hands. Sometimes. The word sometimes sat in the air between them like something with weight. Evelyn said, You know you can always come here, anytime, day or night. Lucy looked up. Even at night? Even at night. Mr. Whitmore doesn't sleep much anyway. Lucy looked across the forge to where Caleb had reappeared and was moving iron with the focused efficiency of a man who knew where everything was by feel. Then she looked back at Evelyn. Okay, she said. It was not enough. Evelyn knew it wasn't enough, but it was what was available, and she filed the rest of it away to be dealt with more carefully when she had thought it through. She told Caleb that evening. She told him plainly, the way she told him most things, without softening it or approaching it sideways. She described the bruise, its location, its shape, Lucy's response. Caleb listened with his eyes on the table. When she finished, the silence stretched long enough that she started to speak again, and he said, I know. She stopped. I've known for a while, he said. Not the specific, not this, but I've known something wasn't right. What have you done about it? A pause. I talked to Jim Dawson, the uncle. When? February, before you came. He turned his cup in his hands. I told him I'd noticed the girl seemed tired, that she seemed like she needed a full night's sleep and regular meals. And? He told me he was doing his best. He said his wife was managing the girl fine. He set the cup down. He wasn't threatening. He was ashamed. I think he was ashamed, which isn't the same as it not happening. Evelyn looked at him. What do we do? I don't know. He said it honestly, without the defensive pride of a man who felt he should have an answer. The law here is... He stopped. Sheriff Brannock is not a bad man, but he doesn't involve himself in domestic matters unless there's something he can't overlook. A bruise shaped like a hand on a 7-year-old isn't something he can overlook. No. He met her eyes. If it happens again. She understood what he meant, and she didn't like it, and she also knew he was right about the mechanics of it, what the law required in 1889 in a Montana town, what a sheriff could and couldn't act on, what would make things better, and what would make them more complicated for a child who still had to sleep in that house every night. There was no clean solution here. There was just the next right step, and the next one after that. She can have supper here, Evelyn said, as often as she wants it. She already does most nights, Evelyn nodded. She'd noticed that. She hadn't said anything because it had seemed like a thing that was working, and you didn't interfere with things that were working. I'm going to talk to Ruth Dawson, she said. The aunt. Caleb looked at her. What will you say? I don't know yet, but I think she's a woman who needs someone to stand beside her, and I think I can do that without making her feel judged. She picked up her mending. Women in difficult households usually know exactly what's wrong. They just need to know they're not alone in seeing it. He watched her hands on the mending. You're good at that, he said, standing beside people. She glanced up. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at his cup. She went back to the mending. May settled into a rhythm that was, by the particular standards of Caleb Whitmore's life, almost alarming in its fullness. The forge was busy in the deep spring way. Every farmer in the valley had something that needed attention before the planting season peaked, and Caleb was working long days without the loneliness that had previously made long days into something to be endured rather than simply weathered. Evelyn had taken over the bookkeeping entirely now, which had previously been conducted in a system Caleb acknowledged was more chaos than system. And the first time she sat down with a year's worth of his invoices and receipts and produced, in 2 evenings, a clear accounting of what he had earned and what he had spent and what remained, he looked at the numbers and felt briefly like a man seeing his own house from the outside for the first time. Is it bad? He asked, which was not a question he enjoyed asking. No, she said, without looking up from the ledger. It's actually quite good. You've been undercharging. I've been... He stopped. Victor Hale said I was overcharging. Victor Hale was getting work done for significantly less than it was worth, and he knew it. She looked up. You've been doing that for everyone, I think. Not drastically, just enough to make yourself easier to tolerate. He sat down slowly. She watched him absorb this. People accept what they're used to, she said, not unkindly. If the scarred blacksmith charges full price, some people call it extortion. If he charges slightly less, they say he knows his place. It's not fair. But I think you've known it and adjusted for it without admitting to yourself that's what you were doing. He looked at the ledger. Raise your prices, she said, by 10%, across the board. Do it quietly and do it now, before the season peaks, when people need you more than they're already annoyed with you. And if they push back, some will, most won't, and the ones who do will be the ones like Hale, who are already looking for a reason. She closed the ledger. The rest of them, Caleb, the rest of them need your work. They need it more than they need to feel like they're doing you a favor. He sat with this. You think they've been doing me a favor, he said, in their own estimation. I think some of them have. Her voice was honest. I think some of them have used your prices as a way of telling themselves they were being charitable, giving the scarred man their business. A pause. A fair price takes that away from them. It makes the transaction what it actually is. A man providing a service and being paid what it's worth. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You have a very clear way of seeing things. It's easier when it's not your own life, she said. He nodded slowly. He raised the prices the following week. Nobody left. The same week he raised his prices, Victor Hale paid. Not the original price, and not with any grace. He sent Roy again, with cash, in an envelope with no accompanying note, which was its own kind of communication. But it was payment, and it was close enough to what had been asked that Caleb accepted it, and did not say anything further about it, and sent back a receipt through Roy that was perfectly civil. Roy took the receipt with the expression of a man who had expected something more dramatic and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or disappointed. Caleb went back to work. He told Evelyn that evening, and she nodded once and said, Good. And that was the end of it as far as she was concerned, which was one of the things he was beginning to understand about her. She didn't need to revisit won battles. She filed them and moved on, and there was something bracing about that, the way cold water was bracing. It made you more alert and slightly uncomfortable, and ultimately more awake. It was Britta Anderson who invited them to supper. The invitation came through her husband, who delivered it in the straightforward, almost administrative way Eric Anderson delivered most things. He came to the forge on a Tuesday, said they were having supper Saturday evening, said Caleb and his wife were welcome if they had no prior engagement, and then waited with the patient stillness of a large man who has said what he came to say and is prepared to wait out any response. Caleb said he would ask his wife. Evelyn, when asked, said yes before he'd finished the question. He'd expected to feel more dread about it than he did. He'd been to very few social suppers in the past decade. His presence at them had the effect of making people careful in the way that the presence of something unfamiliar makes people careful, and careful people exhausted him in a specific way that was worse, somehow, than outright hostility. At least hostility was honest. But he trusted the Andersons, and he trusted, cautiously, that Evelyn's presence would change the texture of the evening, and when they arrived at the Anderson farmhouse on Saturday at 6, and Britta opened the door with the practical warmth of a woman who kept her house the way she kept everything, functional, unshowy, genuinely meant, he found that the dread had been larger than the reality, as dread often was. There were other guests. This had not been mentioned, and Caleb went still for just a moment in the doorway when he saw the Coopers and the Pattersons and Thomas Brody from the feed supply already seated in the front room. Evelyn, just behind him, put her hand briefly on his arm. Not gripping, just contact, just there. And they walked in. The evening was not entirely easy. The Coopers were fine. Amos Cooper had been bringing wagon work to the forge for years and was a fundamentally decent, if unimaginative man, and his wife was pleasant. Brody was Brody. He'd said good morning to Caleb twice now and seemed to have committed to this course of action and wasn't backing down from it. The Pattersons he knew less well, and the husband spent the first half of supper in the specific mode of a man who is sitting near someone he has previously avoided and is now finding, to his private confusion, that there is nothing actually wrong. Evelyn sat between Caleb and Britta Anderson and was, within 20 minutes, in a genuine conversation with both of them about the practicalities of managing root vegetable storage through a Montana winter, which was a real problem, and one that everyone at the table had opinions about, and the normalizing effect of a practical problem discussed by practical people was sufficient to relax the room to the point where Caleb could eat his supper in something close to comfort. After supper, he ended up on the porch with Eric Anderson and Amos Cooper, and they talked about the spring planting and the condition of the East Road, and a rumor that the railroad might eventually extend a spur line toward the valley, which nobody entirely believed but everyone wanted to believe. And it was a conversation between men about the practical concerns of their shared geography, and Caleb was in it rather than adjacent to it, and he noticed this without comment and filed it carefully. Walking home, the night air cold and clear and thick with stars, Evelyn said, "You did well in there." He looked at her. "You were uncomfortable for the first half hour, and then you weren't," she said. "And you didn't let the discomfort make you quiet. Patterson kept looking at me. Patterson is going to look at you for a while yet. He'll stop." "You sound very sure." "I'm not sure," she said. "I think it's likely. Those are different things." A pause. "You were good with Amos Cooper." "I've known Amos for 15 years. "I know. But you were different with him tonight than you are when he comes to the forge. Less," she searched for the word, "less formal. Less like you were conducting a transaction." He thought about this. "The forge is my space," he said. "I know the rules in the forge." "And out here?" "Out here the rules are less clear." She nodded. "They'll get clearer." He wasn't sure if she was right, but he was becoming less sure she was wrong, which was movement of a kind. It was in the second week of May that Caleb found the gap in the forge's west wall. It wasn't structural. It was a gap between the exterior boards, a weather seam that had split open over the winter and admitted a thin blade of cold air that had been there all season and that he'd patched with a rag and forgotten about. Now that the spring warmth was here, he'd pulled out the rag to let the air circulate and discovered that the gap was larger than he'd thought, and that the board on one side of it had begun to rot at the bottom, and that fixing it properly meant pulling that section and replacing it. He spent a morning doing the assessment and concluded that he could do it himself, but it would take 2 full days away from forge work, which in peak season was 2 days he didn't have to spare. He was still working through the problem, whether to delay it, patch it poorly for now, and deal with it properly in the fall, hire it out to someone who'd charge him more than it was worth. When he heard a knock at the forge door that was too heavy for Lucy and too direct for Margaret, he went to the door. Samuel Greer. Caleb hadn't spoken to Samuel Greer directly in over a year, though they'd nodded at each other in the way that Raven Creek men nodded at each other, which conveyed nothing beyond the minimal acknowledgement of shared geography. Samuel Greer was 41 years old, a carpenter who ran a small shop at the north end of the main street, and he held his left arm at a slightly different angle than his right because of the way it had healed after the fire 11 years ago, when Caleb had pulled him out of Hollis Webb's barn with a burning roof falling behind them. They had never talked about the fire, not once, not in 11 years. Samuel stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at Caleb with the look of a man who has been working up to something for some time and has finally committed to it. "I heard about the wall section," he said. Caleb waited. "Margaret mentioned it. She mentions most things." Samuel looked at the wall in question, the visible exterior gap from this angle. "I can do that repair. 2 days? Done right. I've got good board stock." Caleb looked at him. "What would you charge?" Samuel Greer met his eyes. "Nothing." A long silence. "Sam?" "I've been meaning to do something for a long time," Samuel said. He wasn't a man who talked around things, which Caleb had known about him even when they were young. "I haven't known how. I'm a carpenter. This is something I can do." Caleb looked at the wall. The thing about a debt that went unpaid for 11 years was that it changed shape over time. It became something other than a debt, something larger and more complicated, something that had grown scar tissue of its own. He hadn't expected the debt to be addressed. He'd stopped expecting it the second or third year when it became clear that the silence was going to be the permanent arrangement. He'd built his life around the silence, the same way he'd built it around the scar. "The board stock will cost something," Caleb said. "I have it in stock already." "Sam." "Let me do this," Samuel said, and his voice had the quality of a man who is asking something that is also a need. "It's been 11 years. Just let me do this one thing." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said. Samuel Greer put his hat back on. "I'll start Thursday," he said. He left. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment, then went back inside. He sat down at the workbench and didn't pick anything up. He sat there for several minutes. When Evelyn came through from the kitchen and found him sitting without working, which was a thing she had never seen him do, she stopped and looked at him. "What happened?" He told her. She sat down across from him. She didn't say anything for a moment. "How does that feel?" she asked, and her voice was careful, because she knew she was in territory that required care. He thought about the question with more honesty than he usually gave it. "Strange," he said, "like a room I thought was closed turning out to have a door." She nodded slowly. "That's what's happening," she said. "Not all at once, not cleanly, but it's happening." He looked at his hands. "I don't know what to do with it," he said. "When it was just the bad, I knew what to do with the bad. I knew how to carry it. And the other kind is harder. The other kind I don't have practice with." She looked at him steadily. "You have time," she said. He wasn't sure if he believed that, but he wasn't sure he didn't chat. Samuel Greer came on Thursday and started on the wall, and the sound of carpentry work at the side of the forge was strange and companionable at the same time. The particular rhythm of someone else's work nearby, the call-and-response quality of two men working in adjacent spaces and occasionally needing to communicate about something practical, and doing so in the abbreviated language of men who were both focused on their own hands. On the second day, Samuel's son came along to help, a boy of 15 who was learning his father's trade, and who looked at Caleb's forge with the transparent fascination of a teenager encountering hot iron for the first time. Caleb let him stand in his doorway and watch for a while, and then, when the boy's curiosity outpaced his patience, explained briefly what the piece in his hands was, what it was for, how the temperature of the fire changed the behavior of the metal. The boy asked 3 questions in a row, which was 3 more questions than most adults asked him about his work. Caleb answered all of them. Samuel, working on the wallboard outside, could hear the exchange and said nothing, but he said it in the way of a man who is listening with some part of himself that doesn't have a name. Lucy came that afternoon and walked around the carpentry work with enormous professional interest, cross-examining Samuel's son about his tools with the focused authority of a 7-year-old who takes technical matters seriously. The boy answered her with a kind of baffled tolerance that suggested he had not previously met a small girl who wanted a detailed explanation of a draw knife. Evelyn brought out coffee at midday, not just for Caleb, but for Samuel and the boy, and set it on the tailgate of the wagon they'd brought supplies in, and Samuel said thank you, and the boy said thank you, and Lucy told the boy his coffee was too hot, and he should blow on it first. Caleb watched all of this from the forge doorway. He thought about what Evelyn had said, about a room with a door. He thought about the 11 years of building his life around a space that he'd assumed was sealed, and about the specific discomfort of discovering that the assumptions you've built your survival around may not be accurate, and about whether that discomfort was the bad kind or the kind that meant something was changing. He went back inside. He picked up the piece he'd been working on. He worked. It was a Friday evening, 12 days after Samuel finished the wall, when Jim Dawson came to the forge. He came late, past 8, which was past the time that visitors came on any ordinary errand, and he knocked with the knock of a man who has been standing at the door for a few minutes before knocking, which is a different knock from the knock of a man who has knocked directly. Caleb was still in the forge, finishing a hinge set that he wanted done before the weekend, and Evelyn had gone upstairs. He opened the door. Jim Dawson was 44 years old and had the build of a man who had once been strong and had spent a few years since then losing the fight with other things. His face tonight had the specific look of sober shame, which Caleb had seen before on men who were sober and ashamed and not sure what to do with either. "Whitmore," he said. "Jim." A pause. "Can I come in?" Caleb stepped back. Jim came in and looked at the forge. The way people looked at the forge when they came in at night. The fire banked but still casting light, the tools on the walls throwing long shadows, the whole space having a different quality in the dark than it did in the day. He turned his hat in his hands. "I know about the bruise," he said. Caleb said nothing. Ruth told me. Your wife went to see Ruth. He looked at the floor. I didn't know about it. That day, I don't remember it. You don't remember it, Caleb said. The flatness in his voice made Jim flinch. I know how that sounds, Jim said. It sounds like what it is. Yes. A pause. I know. He looked up. I came to tell you it won't happen again. I'm not asking you to believe me. I know you have no reason to. I'm just telling you. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Lucy is 7 years old, Caleb said. I know. She is a 7-year-old girl who lost her parents, and she is living in your house, and she carries what happens in that house in her body. He stopped. His voice had not risen. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because I need you to understand that it is not a thing that affects only you when it happens. Jim Dawson's jaw worked. I understand, he said. Do you? Yes. Caleb looked at him. There is always work here for Lucy, he said finally. Anytime she needs to be somewhere that is not your house, she can be here. I know. Jim's voice was rough. She comes here most afternoons. I know she does. A silence. You're a good man, Whitmore. Jim said it without a particular quality of emotion, not sentimentally, just as a statement of assessed fact. Whatever people here have said, you're a good man. He put his hat back on. He left. Caleb stood in the empty forge for a moment. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Evelyn, who had clearly been awake and listening, she appeared in the doorway. I heard most of it, she said. I know. She looked at him. Do you believe him? He thought about this honestly. I think he means it right now. And later? I don't know. He turned back to the hinge set on the workbench. That's why Lucy knows she can come here. Evelyn stood in the doorway for another moment. You know, she said quietly, you've been taking care of that child for a long time, long before I got here. He picked up the hinge. She's 7 years old, he said, as if that were a complete explanation. To him it was. Evelyn went back upstairs. He worked on the hinges until midnight, when the fire was low and the town outside was completely quiet, and the Montana sky had gone deep and full with stars, and the room above him was occupied, and the walls of the forge were solid, and he was not alone. He banked the fire. He went upstairs. He stood in the hallway between his door and hers for a moment, the same way he'd stood there the first night she'd arrived, and he thought about Jim Dawson and Samuel Greer and Thomas Brody saying good morning and Britta Anderson's supper table and a small girl who showed her hands before coming inside. He thought about what had been the same for 11 years and about what had changed in 10 weeks. He thought about a woman who walked into the middle of a frozen street without armor and stood there and asked the question that needed to be asked. He went into his room. He did not sleep for a while. When he did, it was better than the nights before, and the nights before had already been better than the 11 years preceding them. And he lay in the dark and let that mean what it meant without trying to contain it or explain it or protect himself against it. He was not practiced at this. He was learning. June came in warm and stayed that way, which was unusual enough for Montana that people mentioned it in conversation the way they mentioned anything that deviated from expectation, with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, as if the good weather were a loan that would eventually be called in at interest. The forge was busy in a way that was different from the spring rush. The spring rush had been about volume, everything broken over winter arriving at once, the sheer quantity of accumulated need. June was about the quality of the work, the larger and more complex pieces that required more time and more thought, the kind of ironwork that separated a competent smith from a genuinely skilled one. A new gate commission from the Hendersons, ornamental as well as functional, with a repeating pattern along the crossbars that required Caleb to make the same decorative element 12 times, with enough consistency that they read as intentional. A set of fireplace tools for a house going up on the valley's east side. The new owner having seen ironwork at the Andersons and asked Eric, who had directed him to the forge without, apparently, feeling the need to mention anything other than the quality of the work. The new client's name was Arthur Pennock, and he came into the forge with the careful manner of a man from somewhere else. Helena, it turned out, moving his family to the valley for his wife's health, who was not yet sure of the local customs and was therefore defaulting to his own, which were the customs of a city where transactions were conducted with a certain amount of social lubrication and nobody stared at anything. He did not stare. He looked at the work samples on the shelf, the ones Caleb kept for this purpose. Hinges, bracket work, a decorative piece he'd made years ago from a design he'd worked out himself. And he asked specific questions about the fireplace tools and listened to the answers and said he'd like to proceed. Then he looked at Caleb directly and said, "Are you the man who fixed the Anderson gate?" "Yes." "Eric Anderson speaks highly of you." Caleb nodded once. "He also told me," Pennock said, with the care of a man choosing his words, "that you are a man who does honest work for a fair price and that I would not regret bringing you my business." He paused. "I'm inclined to trust Eric Anderson's judgment." "That's sensible of you," Caleb said. "He has good judgment." Pennock smiled slightly. "He does." He picked up the decorative piece from the shelf, the one with the curving pattern, and turned it over. "Did you design this?" "Yes." "It's good work." He set it down. "My wife is going to want to see what you do with the fireplace tools before we commission anything else for the house, but I expect she'll want more." He shook Caleb's hand and left, and Caleb stood in the forge for a moment afterward with the particular feeling of a man who has been spoken to as a craftsman and not as an accommodation. He went back to the Henderson gate. Evelyn had been visiting Ruth Dawson twice a week since April. She hadn't announced this as a plan. It had begun as the one visit she'd described to Caleb, the visit after she'd seen the bruise. And it had continued because Ruth Dawson was a woman who needed someone to visit her, and Evelyn was someone who had a talent for being present in the way that helped without overwhelming, which was a rare skill and one she'd developed out of necessity rather than virtue. Ruth was 40 years old and had the look of a woman who had been resilient for so long that the resilience had become a kind of posture. She held herself very straight and spoke in measured sentences and kept her kitchen orderly in the particular way of someone who controlled what she could, because other things were not within her control. She had married Jim Dawson at 26 because he had been, at 26, a different version of the man he'd become, and she had spent 14 years making adjustments she hadn't anticipated. She was not a victim in any simple sense. She was a complicated person in a difficult situation, which was less dramatic and more accurate. She and Evelyn talked about practical things, mostly. The garden. The cost of dry goods. A dress pattern Ruth had been working from that had a flaw in the sleeve measurement. They didn't talk about Jim directly unless Ruth brought it up, which she did occasionally, carefully, in the sideways manner of a woman who needed to name a thing without making it larger than she could manage. After the third visit, Lucy started sitting with them when she was there. She didn't participate in the conversation much. She sat near Ruth and worked on whatever small project she'd brought. A drawing, a piece of string she was weaving into something, once the iron bird which she now rarely left home without. And the presence of the child in the room changed the quality of the visits in a way that was hard to articulate but easy to feel. Ruth was different with Lucy nearby. She sat differently. Her voice was slightly warmer. The measured posture came down a degree. Evelyn noticed this and filed it away. She was building something here. She knew. Something patient and structural. The kind of thing that didn't show from the outside until it was already solid. She didn't have a name for it. She was not the kind of woman who named things before they were real. The letter from Boston arrived on a Thursday in the second week of June. Caleb brought it in from the post office. Margaret had handed it over with the particular expression she wore when she had information she wanted to share, but had decided, for once, to exercise restraint, and set it on the kitchen table where Evelyn would find it. He didn't mention it when she came in. He was in the forge and heard her come through the kitchen, and there was a silence that was slightly longer than the usual pause between coming in and beginning whatever came next. And then she came to the forge doorway. She had the letter in her hand, unopened. "It's from my sister," she said. He looked up. She'd mentioned the sister once, briefly, early on. A younger sister in Boston, married, 2 children, comfortable in the moderate way that people were comfortable when they weren't quite flourishing but weren't struggling either. The relationship had been described in terms that suggested warmth that had been complicated by geography and by the particular dynamic of a sibling who was stable watching another sibling navigate sustained difficulty. "Are you going to open it?" he asked. "In a moment." She was looking at the envelope. "She hasn't written since I came here." He waited. "She told me not to come," Evelyn said. When I decided to answer your advertisement, she told me it was foolish and that I was making a decision out of desperation and that I would regret it. He didn't say anything to that. She wasn't wrong about the desperation, Evelyn said. Partly. I was in a situation in Boston that wasn't going to improve. I want to be honest about that. I didn't come here purely because I was drawn to your honesty, though I was. I also came because I needed to come somewhere. He put down the piece in his hands. I know that, he said. She looked at him. You said as much in your first letter, he said. You said you'd been managing on very little. I didn't think you were coming for the scenery. Something moved through her face. No, she said. I wasn't. What did you come for then? He asked it without accusation, as a genuine question, the kind he'd been turning over for months, and hadn't asked directly because there were things he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. She was quiet for a moment. I came because you were honest, she said. That was real. And because I was someone who needed to start over in a place where I wasn't already a version of myself that wasn't working. She looked at the letter. And I was afraid. I don't say that to make it sound more heroic than it was. I was afraid and I made a decision anyway, and I didn't know if it would work. He looked at her across the forge. Did it? He asked. She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. And then, after a pause, did it work for you? He'd thought about this question in various forms for months, in the early mornings before the forge work started and in the late evenings after it ended, turning it over the way he turned a problem piece of iron in his hands, looking at it from different angles. He was not a man who answered things quickly when the answer mattered. More than I expected, he said, which is more than I can say for most things. She nodded once. She opened the letter. He went back to work. She read it in the kitchen, and whatever was in it took a while to read, and when she came back, she stood in the doorway and said, She wants to know if I'm all right. Are you? Yes. A pause. She also says she's glad I wrote to her. I wrote to her in April. I told her about here, about you. She stopped. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because it matters to you, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. It does. She went back to the kitchen to write her reply, and Caleb worked on the Henderson gate, and the afternoon came on slow and golden the way June afternoons did in Montana when the weather was kind. And neither of them mentioned the conversation again, but it sat in the space between them differently than it had before. Not as a gap, but as something crossed. It was Dale Gruber who caused the next problem, which surprised nobody who knew Dale Gruber. He was not a malicious man in any deliberate way. He was the kind of man who needed to be at the center of a narrative and who generated narratives when none were conveniently available, which in a small town was a consistently dangerous quality. He had been, since Evelyn's arrival, and particularly since the public confrontation with Victor Hale in April, in a state of frustrated recalibration. The story he'd been telling, that the scarred blacksmith's mail-order bride would leave, that the whole arrangement was a spectacle of misplaced hope, that Raven Creek was watching a slow-motion failure, had not unfolded as narrated, and this had not improved his disposition. What he said, on a Thursday evening at his saloon, in the presence of 6 men who were either too tired to object or too comfortable to leave, was not the worst thing anyone had ever said about Caleb Whitmore. But it was said loudly, and it was said with the particular cruelty of a man who has run out of legitimate criticisms and is reaching for something more personal. He said that any woman who'd willingly married Caleb Whitmore had either lied about her circumstances or was herself damaged in some way that explained the choice. He said it with the tone of a man offering a reasonable analysis of available evidence. Thomas Brody, who was there and who had said good morning to Caleb 7 times now and was apparently deeply committed to this course of action, told him to shut up. Dale was surprised enough by this that he did, briefly. But words in a saloon had a way of moving, and by the following morning, the substance of what Dale had said had made its way to Margaret Finley, who told no one but whose silence on the subject was itself a kind of communication, and it made its way to Britta Anderson, who told Eric, who set his jaw in the specific way that meant he was containing an impulse he was deciding whether to act on. It made its way eventually to Evelyn. She heard it from Catherine Walsh at the general store, delivered with the apologetic care that Catherine seemed to reserve for information she knew would land badly, but that she felt was better delivered by a friend than discovered another way. Evelyn thanked her and bought her flour and walked home. She was quiet over supper. Caleb noticed, because he noticed most things about her now, the specific quality of her silences, which varied as much as her words did. This silence had edges. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without his expression changing, which was the practiced stillness of a man who had received this category of information many times before. But she was watching him with more attention than most people gave him, and she saw the thing that happened underneath the stillness, the small, controlled tightening, the way he set his fork down with slightly more deliberateness than the action required. "Gruber," he said. "Yes." A pause. "It's not new," he said. "It's new about me." He looked at her. She was looking back at him steadily, and he saw something in her face that he recognized because he knew it in himself. Not hurt, exactly, but the specific reaction of a person who has been reduced to a symptom of someone else's problem, who has been made into an explanation for something rather than a person making a choice. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't apologize," she said. "You didn't say it." "I know. I'm sorry it happened." A pause. "Gruber says things. He's been saying things about me for years." "About you, yes," she said. "That's different from this." He understood what she meant. About him, the things people said were about what he looked like, about the scar, about the fire, and what it had made him. Those things had been said for 11 years, and they had a shape he knew how to hold. What Gruber had said about Evelyn was different in its mechanism. It had made her decision into a deficiency, her choice into an indicator of damage, and that was a thing with a different kind of edge. "Do you want me to say something to him?" Caleb asked. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I want to handle it myself." He looked at her. "How?" She picked up her fork. "I haven't decided yet." What she decided 3 days later was to do nothing dramatic at all. She walked into Dale Gruber's saloon on a Saturday at noon, which was not an hour when women generally entered saloons in Raven Creek, and she walked up to the bar and asked Dale Gruber if he had a few minutes. Dale, who had been expecting something louder, was sufficiently wrong-footed by the measured tone that he said yes, and led her to a table at the side of the room, and they sat down, and she looked at him with the level attention she gave to things she had thought through carefully. "I'm not here to threaten you," she said. "I'm not going to tell my husband what you said, and I'm not going to tell everyone in town." Dale opened his mouth. "I'm here," she continued, "because I think you're a man who says things without fully considering what they cost other people. And I think that comes from not having anyone who tells you when you've gone too far." She paused. "So I'm telling you." Dale looked at her. "What you said about me was cruel," she said. "Not because it hurt my feelings, although it wasn't pleasant. It was cruel because it was designed to take a choice I made, a choice I thought about carefully and made freely, and make it into something shameful. You looked at a woman who is capable of making her own decisions, and you decided her decision needed an explanation that made her smaller." She kept her voice even. "I don't need an explanation. I'm not broken. I chose my husband because he's an honest man and a good one, and the fact that this town spent 11 years failing to notice that is not a mark against him, or against me." Dale Gruber sat very still. She stood up. "I'm not asking for an apology," she said. "I'm asking you to think before the next time." She looked at him directly. "That's all." She walked out. Dale sat at his table for several minutes after she left, and he said nothing to anyone about the conversation, which was probably the most significant detail of the whole event. Caleb found out because Thomas Brody told him. Brody had heard from someone who'd been in the saloon and had watched Evelyn walk in and walk out, and he told Caleb on a Tuesday morning with the expression of a man delivering news he is enjoying considerably. Caleb listened. "She went in herself," he said. "Walked right in, sat down with Gruber." Brody shook his head. "I would have paid to see his face." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "What did she say?" he asked. Brody gave him the summary, which was second-hand and probably imprecise in the details, but accurate in the substance. Caleb nodded slowly. "She didn't tell me," he said. "Doesn't seem like a woman who needs to report in," Brody said, not unkindly. Caleb considered this. "No," he said. "She isn't." He thought about it for the rest of the morning, about the fact that she had handled it herself, without asking him, without telling him she was going to. Not because she was keeping it from him, he suspected, but because it was hers to handle, and she'd handled it, and that was the end of it as far as she was concerned. She had told him once that she wasn't interested in performing. He was beginning to understand what that meant in practice. It meant she did what she thought was right, and she didn't wait for permission, and she didn't need applause. He finished the Henderson Gate that afternoon. It was the best piece of ornamental work he'd done in years, and he knew it. 12 matching decorative elements, consistent enough to read as intentional, distinct enough to show the hand that made them. He stood back from it and looked at it for a while and felt the clean satisfaction of a thing done right, which was a feeling he was good at, that had kept him going through years when other feelings were not available. Then he went inside and told Evelyn what Brody had said. She looked up from the ledger she was working in. "Brody told you," she said. "Yes." She nodded and went back to the ledger. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up again. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. You didn't have to do it without telling me." She put down her pen. "Would you have let me?" A pause. "That's not—" He stopped. "You would have wanted to go instead," she said, "or wanted to come, or you would have worried." She looked at him steadily. "It wasn't your fight, Caleb. He said it about me. I dealt with it." He looked at her. "I'm not used to someone fighting their own fights in my direction," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Get used to it," she said. He almost smiled. She went back to the ledger. He sat down across from her and picked up the newspaper that had come in on Tuesday's mail and read it without reading it, his eyes moving over the words while his mind was somewhere else entirely, in the particular space that opened up when something changed in him that he hadn't expected to change. It was Lucy who noticed first that something was different between them. She was not a child who missed things. She had spent enough time in an unpredictable household to have developed the keen peripheral awareness of someone who had learned to read rooms for safety, and she applied this skill to every environment she entered, including the forge, with comprehensive and largely unconscious thoroughness. What she noticed, on a Wednesday in late June, was that when Evelyn handed Caleb a cup of coffee she'd brought from the kitchen, and he said thank you, they looked at each other for approximately 1 second longer than the transaction required, and that when Caleb was explaining something about the piece he was working on, the fireplace tools for Pennock, nearly finished, and Evelyn was in the doorway listening, he turned to look at her occasionally, in the middle of the explanation, the way people turned toward things they wanted to confirm were still there. Lucy sat on her stool and observed all of this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old scientist. After a while she said, "Do you like each other?" Both adults looked at her. "As in," she clarified, "as more than the married type, like the actually like each other type." A silence. Caleb looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Caleb. "That's a very direct question," Evelyn said to Lucy. "You always say direct questions are the good kind," Lucy said. Evelyn had in fact said this. She received it back now without visible regret. "Yes," she said to Lucy. "We like each other." Lucy nodded, satisfied. "I thought so. You look at each other like Mrs. Anderson looks at Mr. Anderson." "How does Mrs. Anderson look at Mr. Anderson?" Caleb asked, genuinely curious. Like she already knows what he's going to say, but she wants to hear it anyway. Another silence. Caleb picked up the file he'd set down. "Go help Evelyn with the bread," he said. "The bread's already done," Lucy said. "Go see if it is." Lucy slid off the stool and went into the kitchen, and Caleb did not look at Evelyn, and Evelyn did not look at Caleb, and neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them needed to. The last week of June brought the first real crisis since Victor Hale. It came from a direction Caleb hadn't anticipated, which was the direction of his own body. He'd been ignoring a pain in his right hand for 3 weeks. Not ignoring it exactly. He was aware of it, a deep ache in the heel of the palm that flared when he gripped the hammer at a certain angle, that had started as something mild and built into something that required active management. He'd been adjusting his grip without thinking about it, compensating with his wrist and shoulder in ways that were probably creating other problems. And he'd said nothing about it because saying something meant admitting that the forge, which had been the foundation of everything, the one reliable thing in 11 years of unreliable living, was dependent on a part of him that was not performing as it should. Evelyn noticed on a Tuesday evening. She noticed because she saw him flex his right hand over the kitchen table after supper, a gesture so automatic he probably didn't know he was doing it, and she saw his face when he did it, and she said, "How long has your hand been bothering you?" He stopped flexing it. "A few weeks," he said. "Let me see." "It's fine." "Caleb." Her voice was not sharp. It was the voice she used when she had already decided something and was waiting for him to catch up. "Let me see your hand." He put it on the table. She took it in both of hers, matter-of-factly, the way she handled most things, and pressed gently along the heel of his palm, watching his face rather than his hand to see where the reaction was. He kept his face controlled. She pressed a specific point and his jaw tightened involuntarily. "There," she said. "It's not serious." "You don't know that. It's a muscle thing. It'll work itself out." She held his hand in both of hers for a moment, not examining it anymore, just holding it, and she said, "You need to rest it. I have 3 commissions outstanding." "I know. You need to rest it anyway." He pulled his hand back gently. "Evelyn, you are the only blacksmith within 40 miles, she said. "If your hand fails completely, those 3 commissions become 6 months behind and everything that depends on this forge stops." She met his eyes. 2 days. Rest it for 2 days, and then see where it is. He looked at her. 2 days, she said. "I will handle anything that comes in. I can take orders, I can tell people you're working through a backlog. I can manage the front of this business for 2 days. He wanted to argue. He recognized the argument. It was the one he'd been having with himself for 3 weeks. The one that went, "I don't need help. I've always done this alone. The forge doesn't stop." He knew the argument well. He also knew, sitting across from someone who had organized his accounts and fixed his roof and walked into a saloon on his behalf and stood in the middle of a frozen street without armor, that the argument was not as solid as it used to be. 2 days, he said. 2 days. He rested his hand. It was, practically speaking, 2 of the more difficult days he'd spent at the forge, because being at the forge without working was a particular kind of frustration. He could see everything that needed doing and could not do it, and the impulse to pick up a tool was strong enough that he had to consciously redirect himself approximately every 20 minutes. Evelyn managed the front of the operation with the same methodical competence she gave everything. She spoke to the 2 clients who came by during those 2 days in the measured, informative tone of a woman who knew what she was talking about because she'd spent 3 months listening to a man talk about his work, and she sent both of them away satisfied and rescheduled. She also, without telling him she was going to, stopped by Samuel Greer's carpenter shop and asked him if he knew anything about hand injuries and tradesmen. Samuel had, as it happened, dealt with his own share of wrist and hand problems in 20 years of carpentry, and he sent back with Evelyn a set of instructions for a specific strengthening routine that Caleb received with the resigned acceptance of a man who has run out of reasons to resist being helped. He did the exercises. His hand improved. On the evening of the second day, they sat outside the forge in the long June light, the sky still pale at 8 in the evening, the Montana summer doing what it did in June, stretching the day out past any reasonable expectation. They sat on the bench Caleb had built the previous spring for no particular reason, which had turned out to have the particular reason of being the right height and angle for sitting outside in the evenings and watching the street wind down. They'd fallen into this habit gradually, the way they'd fallen into most things. Not by deciding to do it, but by doing it and then finding themselves doing it again. Tonight Lucy was with them, sitting on the ground nearby with her iron bird in her hands, conducting what appeared to be a personal conversation with it in a voice too low to hear. Caleb watched the street. He was aware, in the specific way he was becoming aware of things he had not previously had the tools to name, that this was a particular kind of moment, the kind that didn't announce itself as significant while it was happening, but that settled into memory differently from the ordinary run of days. "Evelyn," he said. What would you have done if you'd come off the stagecoach and decided you couldn't stay?" She was quiet for a moment. "Gone back," she said. "Eventually. Found something else." "Would you have?" She considered it honestly. "I don't know. I was in a difficult enough situation in Boston that going back was not a particularly good option. But I would have found something." He nodded. "Are you asking if I stayed because I had to?" she said. "No." He looked at the street. I know why you stayed. I've known for a while. She turned her head to look at him. Then what are you asking? He thought about how to say it. He was not a man who spoke about the interior of himself easily, and the words he was trying to form were in territory he didn't have reliable language for. But she had earned them, and he knew it, and there was a difference between not having the words and choosing not to use them. I'm asking, he said slowly, whether you're carrying anything here that you shouldn't have to carry. She was quiet. Because I know, he said, that I am not easy. I know that the way this town has been is not. He stopped. I know what you came into when you came here, and I want to know if I'm asking too much of you without asking. She turned back toward the street. Lucy had fallen asleep on the ground, her head on her arm, the iron bird still loosely held in her fist. Caleb, Evelyn said, I am a grown woman who made a decision with her eyes open. She paused. I am not carrying anything I didn't choose to pick up. That's not quite an answer. No, she agreed. It isn't. A pause. The honest answer is that some of it is hard. Some days the town still looks at you in ways that make me want to say something I shouldn't. Some days I think about Boston and my sister and the life I knew, and it's complicated. She looked at her hands. But when I look at what I have now and what I had then, there's no version of events where I would change this. He looked at her. You're sure, he said. She looked back at him. I am rarely sure of anything, she said, but I'm sure of this. He looked at Lucy on the ground, the bird in her sleeping hand. He looked at the street, at the forge wall Samuel Greer had repaired, at the window where the light from the kitchen made a rectangle of gold on the dirt outside. He was 58 days away from the fear that had driven him to put an 11-word advertisement in a Boston paper, and the fear was still there. It didn't disappear. It didn't become irrelevant. It sat in the corner of everything and watched. But it was smaller than it had been, not because anything had silenced it, but because other things had grown large enough that it no longer had the room to itself. He didn't say any of this. He sat on the bench in the long evening light, and the forge was behind him, and the street was in front of him, and Evelyn was beside him, and Lucy slept on the ground with the iron bird in her hand. And eventually the light finally faded, and the stars came out over Montana, and the night air came in cool from the mountains. And Caleb stood up and carefully picked Lucy up off the ground without waking her, and carried her inside to the kitchen cot they'd set up for the night she stayed, and covered her with the quilt that had been Evelyn's idea, and settled her iron bird beside her where she'd find it in the morning. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment. Then he went back outside. Evelyn was still on the bench. He sat back down. They sat there for a while longer, not talking, not needing to. The silence between them, the good kind. The kind that held everything they hadn't said and didn't need to, because some things were true whether they were spoken or not. And the speaking of them could wait for the right moment. And the right moment had not quite arrived. But Caleb Whitmore could feel it coming in the way a man who has spent his life working with heat and metal develops the ability to feel the temperature of things without touching them. The way he knew, before he put the iron in the fire, how long it would take to reach the point where it was ready to be shaped. He was not there yet, but he was close. July arrived the way the best things in life arrived, without announcement, without fanfare, simply there. One morning when you looked up from whatever you'd been doing and realized the season had changed while you weren't watching. The valley was full green now, the kind of green that Montana only managed for about 8 weeks before the summer started tipping toward the long bronze of August and then the hard colors of fall. The mornings were cool enough to want a jacket, and the afternoons were warm enough to leave it inside, and the light had that particular quality of long northern summers where it stayed useful well into the evening and made the days feel more generous than they had any right to be. Caleb's hand had healed well enough to work without modification, which was a relief so large he hadn't let himself fully feel it until it was real. He'd done the exercises Samuel sent with a diligence that Evelyn noted without comment, and the deep ache in the heel of his palm had receded to something he was aware of only when he'd been at the hammer for more than 4 hours at a stretch, which told him to stop and gave him a reason to stop that he would not otherwise have permitted himself. This was, he recognized, probably a net improvement in his working habits, although he would not have chosen the method of arriving at it. The Pennock fireplace tools were delivered in the first week of July and received with a warmth that was, for Arthur Pennock, probably normal, and for Caleb, unprecedented. Pennock's wife came with him to collect them. a small, quiet woman named Clara, who had the careful movements of someone who'd been ill for a while and was learning to trust her own body again. And she stood in the forge and looked at the set of tools laid out on the workbench and ran her fingers along the handle of the poker, where Caleb had inlaid a pattern of leaves along the upper grip. "You designed this?" she asked. "Yes." She looked up at him, not at his scar, or rather, she looked at him the way people looked at you when they were actually looking at you, rather than at the most striking thing about your appearance, and she said, "It's the most beautiful ironwork I've ever seen in person." He didn't have a ready response to that. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "We'll want more," she said simply. "When we're settled. Whatever you think the house needs." She said it like a collaboration, like the house was a project they were undertaking together. He watched them go and stood in the forge door for a moment and thought about how a sentence could land in a place you didn't know was empty until something filled it. It was Britta Anderson who organized it, which surprised no one who knew Britta Anderson. The summer gathering was a Raven Creek institution, a loose annual event held on the first Saturday of July, on the flat field behind the schoolhouse, involving food brought from every household and a general expectation that the town would behave like a community for one afternoon, even if it spent the rest of the year being a collection of individuals with competing interests. It had been going on for as long as anyone could remember. It had no formal structure and no official organizer, but it had Britta Anderson, which was functionally the same thing. Caleb had attended for most of the years he'd been in Raven Creek. Attended was the accurate word. He'd been present. He'd eaten, stood on the periphery of conversations, accepted the food that people offered with the correct social gestures, and gone home. He had not, in any meaningful sense, been part of it. Britta came to the forge on a Wednesday and told Evelyn the gathering was Saturday, and that she expected them both, and that she had put Evelyn in charge of a dessert contribution, which was Britta's way of ensuring attendance through obligation. Evelyn said she'd bring apple cake. Britta said good and left. Caleb, who had heard this from the forge, came to the kitchen doorway and said, "You didn't ask me." "I know," Evelyn said. "I might have had a reason not to go." "Do you?" A pause. "No," he said. "Then we're going." He went back to the forge. He was not dreading it exactly. The shape of things in Raven Creek had changed enough in 4 months that the specific quality of dread he'd previously associated with public gatherings had shifted. It was smaller and differently located, more like a low-level wariness than an active anticipation of pain. But it was still there, and he was honest enough with himself to know it, and honest enough with Evelyn to not pretend it wasn't. "It'll be fine," she said that evening, without him having said anything about it. He looked at her. "You've been thinking about Saturday all day," she said. "I can tell because you've filed that same piece of iron twice already without moving to the next step." He looked at the piece in his hands. She was right. "It'll be fine," she said again. "And if it's not fine, we'll leave. Together." The together landed the way she probably knew it would. "All right," he said. Saturday was clear and warm, the kind of day that made even skeptical people feel temporarily optimistic about the general situation of being alive in the world. The field behind the schoolhouse filled up across the morning with people from every corner of the valley, and the long tables that materialized for these occasions were covered with food by noon in the particular abundance of a community that expressed things through cooking that it didn't know how to express directly. Evelyn's apple cake was on the table within 10 minutes of their arrival, and Britta Anderson materialized almost immediately to tell her it looked good and to steer her toward a cluster of women who were engaged in a conversation about something Caleb didn't hear because he was already watching the field and running the internal calculation that he always ran in public spaces, where the easy exits were, which groups of people required the most navigation, how to move through the space without forcing anyone to have an interaction they hadn't chosen. Old habit. He was still running it when Thomas Brody appeared at his elbow. "Whitmore," Brody said. "Brody." Brody handed him a cup of something cold, which turned out to be lemonade, and they stood together watching the field in the comfortable silence of two men who had found, over the past few months, that they could occupy the same space without either of them having to work at it. Eric Anderson joined them after a while. Then Samuel Greer with his son. Then, unexpectedly, Arthur Pennick, who was clearly navigating the gathering as his own first public appearance in the valley and who seemed relieved to find a small cluster of men who were not aggressively social. They stood together and talked in the loose, non-linear way that men talked at outdoor gatherings, about the East Road and the railroad rumor, and the condition of the summer grazing, and whether the Henderson barn would need reinforcing before the next winter. And Caleb was in the conversation, not beside it, and nobody managed his presence or modulated their behavior around it. And the afternoon moved on in the way that good afternoons moved, unhurriedly and without requiring anything of him except to be there. He ate. He talked. He watched Lucy, who had come with Ruth Dawson and was engaged in a complex negotiation with several other children that appeared to involve the Iron Bird as some kind of currency or status object. At one point, he looked across the field and found Evelyn. She was talking to Clara Pennock and Britta Anderson, the three of them standing in the sun, and she was saying something that made Clara Pennock laugh, and she looked like a woman who was standing on ground that belonged to her. She looked up and found him looking, and she didn't smile exactly, but something moved across her face that was better than a smile, and then she went back to her conversation. He went back to his. It was later, in the long afternoon, that Victor Hale arrived. He came alone and on foot, which was unusual for a man who habitually used his horse as an extension of his bearing, and he walked through the gathering with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before he changes his mind. He was wearing his good coat, which was either a coincidence or a significant detail. He stopped in front of Caleb. Caleb watched him stop and waited. The men around them, Brody, Anderson, Samuel, had gone quiet in the particular way that people went quiet when they sensed the possibility of something they were going to be watching. Victor Hale looked at Caleb for a moment. He said, "I want to settle the business between us." "It's been settled," Caleb said. "The payment, yes." Victor's jaw worked slightly, the way it did when he was managing something he didn't find natural. "Not the rest of it." Caleb said nothing. "I said things," Victor said. "In public. About your face. About your work." A pause. "About your wife." Silence. "I am not a man who apologizes easily," Victor said, and this was clearly true and also clearly a thing he knew about himself and had made a calculation about. "But I said things that were unfair, that were—" He stopped, tried again. "That were beneath what a man ought to say." The field around them had gone very quiet, in the particular way that outdoor gatherings went quiet when something was happening that everyone needed to hear. Caleb looked at Victor Hale, at his pale eyes and his expensive coat, and the particular rigidity of a man who was doing something that cost him but had decided to pay the cost. And he thought about 11 years of this man's contempt, and about the street in April and Evelyn standing in it, and about what it meant to receive an apology that was real enough to be difficult for the person giving it. "All right," Caleb said. Victor seemed to have expected more resistance. He blinked. "That's it?" he said. "You said what you came to say. I heard it." Caleb looked at him. "I don't need more than that." A pause. "Your price was fair," Victor said. It came out like a concession and an admission simultaneously. "I knew it was fair." "I know you did." Victor looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded, once, and walked back through the gathering the way he'd come, and the field exhaled around him, and conversations resumed, and Brody said quietly, beside Caleb, "Well, didn't expect that." "Neither did I," Caleb said. He meant it. He didn't know that Evelyn had gone to see Victor Hale. He found out 3 days later, not from her, but from Margaret Finley, who had seen Evelyn walking to the Hale property the previous week, and whose policy of restraint had its limits. He came home that evening and sat down at the kitchen table and waited until she looked up from what she was doing. "You went to see Hale," he said. She set down her pen. "Yes," she said. "When?" "The Tuesday before the gathering." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you say to him?" She considered her answer carefully, which was one of the things he'd come to recognize as a sign that she was going to tell him the truth and wanted to tell it accurately. "I told him that he was a man who had built his position in this valley on the labor of people he didn't respect," she said, "and that my husband's labor had been part of that, and that I thought he knew it, and that it had been easier for him to mock the man than to acknowledge the debt." She paused. "I told him that acknowledgement didn't cost as much as he thought it did. that it might in fact cost him less than continuing the way he was going. Caleb looked at the table. You made the case for his own interests, he said. I don't think shame alone moves men like Victor Hale, she said, but self-interest usually does. And you think that's why he came? I think he came because both things were true, she said. The shame and the self-interest. People are rarely moved by only one thing. He was quiet for a long moment. You should have told me, he said. I know. She met his eyes. I was afraid you'd try to stop me. I would have. Yes. She didn't look away. And I thought this was something that needed to happen, and I didn't want to have the argument about whether it should, because I would have won the argument, and then you would have been unhappy about it. He looked at her. You were going to do it regardless of what I said. Yes, she said, but I would have felt worse about it if we'd argued first. He sat back in his chair. He should have been angry. There was a version of him, the version that had spent 11 years being very careful about what he let himself need from other people, who had built a careful architecture of self-sufficiency around his solitude. That would have been angry. That would have taken the undisclosed visit as evidence of exactly the kind of management and handling that he'd never wanted. But he looked at Evelyn, who was watching him with the steady honesty she'd brought to everything since the first letter, and he thought about what she'd actually done. Walked to a man's property and told him what she thought and made the case that she believed needed making. And he found that what he actually felt was not anger. It was something considerably more difficult. You keep doing things, he said. I do. For me. Not entirely for you. She picked up her pen. Partly for me. I don't enjoy watching good work go unrecognized. It offends my sense of order. He almost smiled. Evelyn. She looked up. Thank you, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. You're welcome, she said. Yeah. It was on a Thursday evening in the third week of July that he finally said the thing he'd been carrying. Not planned, not rehearsed. They were outside on the bench in the evening light, the habit so established now that it had become simply a part of the day, the way the morning fire and the noon coffee were parts of the day. And Lucy had gone home to the Dawsons, and the street was quiet, and Caleb had been sitting for 20 minutes without speaking, which was not unusual except that this particular silence had a different weight. Evelyn felt it and said nothing, which was the right thing. He stared at the middle distance for a while longer. Then he said, I've been waiting for you to leave. She turned to look at him. Since the beginning, he said. I've been waiting for the moment when you decided this was a mistake. When you looked at the scar or the town or the life here and concluded that you'd made a bad calculation. He was looking at his hands. I've been waiting for it every day. She was quiet. It hasn't happened, he said. And I don't know what to do with that. She looked at him steadily. Because you've been preparing for the loss, she said, instead of the thing itself. Yes. Instead of what's actually here. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, and he sat with the exposure of having said it out loud, which was considerable. The specific vulnerability of admitting a fear to the person whose departure you've been afraid of, which was either brave or foolish, and he still wasn't sure which. Caleb, she said, I need you to look at me. He looked at her. She reached out and put her hand against the left side of his face, the scarred side, the side he turned away from mirrors, the side he'd been managing the world's reaction to for 11 years. Not tentatively, deliberately, with the flat of her palm, the way you touched something you weren't afraid of. He went very still. I did not come here despite this, she said. I came here because of what went with it. The man who put no illusions in a newspaper advertisement. The man who built a room for a woman he didn't know and put wildflowers on the table because he didn't know what else to do. She didn't move her hand. The man who made iron animals for a 7-year-old girl and went into a burning barn for people he didn't have to save. She looked at him. I didn't get the wrong man, Caleb. I got exactly the man I came for. He said nothing. His throat had done something inconvenient and he was waiting for it to clear. I'm not going to leave, she said. I want you to stop spending your days waiting for it. It's a waste of your attention, and I need your attention on other things. Something broke open in him quietly. Not dramatically, not with any of the external markers of a significant moment. He was still sitting on the bench in the evening light with her hand against his face, and the street was still quiet, and the forge was still behind them, and he was still the scarred blacksmith of Raven Creek, Montana, not redeemed, not transformed, not made into someone he wasn't. Just seen, fully and without flinching, seen. He put his hand over hers, he held it there. "All right," he said, which was not sufficient, but she nodded once as if it were, and they stayed like that for a while in the fading light before she moved her hand, and he let it go, and they sat back on the bench and watched the street go dark together. Lucy came the next morning earlier than usual. She knocked. She showed her hands. She came in and went directly to the shelf at the back of the forge where the iron animals lived, the horse, the dog, the bird, and she stood looking at them for a moment before turning around. "I heard Uncle Jim talking to Aunt Ruth last night," she said. Caleb kept working. "What about?" "He's going to stop drinking," Lucy said, with the careful precision of a child repeating something she's holding very gently. "He said he made a promise to Aunt Ruth, and he's going to keep it." A pause. "He's said it before." "I know," Caleb said. "Do you think he'll keep it this time?" He stopped working. He thought about Jim Dawson standing in the forge at night with his hat in his hands, and the specific look of a man who is ashamed and sober and not sure what to do with either. He thought about what Evelyn had said, that some things required you to do them imperfectly for a long time before they started working. "I think he's going to try," Caleb said, "and I think trying matters." Lucy thought about this. "If he doesn't keep it," she said, "can I still come here?" "You can always come here," he said. "I've told you that." She nodded and reached up and touched the iron bird on the shelf, confirming it was real. "Mr. Caleb," she said. "Are you happy now?" He looked at her. She was watching him with the direct, uncurated attention of a child who has not yet learned to soften the questions she actually wants the answers to. He thought about the question with more honesty than he usually gave himself credit for. "More than I was," he said. "Yes." She seemed to find this satisfactory. "Good," she said. "You were too quiet before. It made the forge feel sad." He looked at her. "The forge felt sad," he repeated. "Not anymore, though." She climbed up on her stool. "Now it feels like a place." He thought about that for a moment, what it meant, for a space to feel like a place. The distinction she was drawing with the instinct children had for the things adults theorized about. "Yes," he said. "It does." The summer moved through July and into August, the way Montana summers did. Fast, generous, never quite long enough. The work continued. The town continued. The slow renegotiation of Caleb Whitmore's place in Raven Creek continued in the unspectacular, incremental way that real change happened, without ceremony, without a moment of formal resolution, just the accumulated weight of many small interactions conducted differently than they'd been conducted before. Thomas Brody said good morning every time. He had apparently decided this was simply what he did now, and he did it with the consistency of a man who has made a commitment and intends to honor it regardless of whether anyone is paying attention. The Andersons had them to supper twice more. The second time, it was just the four of them, which was easier and different in a way that was better. Less performance, more the simple reality of two couples who found each other's company genuinely tolerable. Arthur Pennock came back with a commission for Garden Gate Hardware and brought Clara, and Clara and Evelyn stood in the forge together while Caleb showed them design options, and Clara asked questions that were better than most of the questions he'd been asked about his work in years. Dale Gruber said nothing further about either Caleb or Evelyn in his saloon, which was the closest thing to an apology that the situation was going to produce, and everyone understood this and accepted it as sufficient. Victor Hale brought his wagons back in August for the second repair of the year, and paid the full price with Roy and an envelope and no note. And Caleb sent back a receipt and did the work and did it well, because doing work well was not contingent on the character of the person who had commissioned it. Jim Dawson had 3 bad weeks in August, and then a better month in September. Caleb knew this because Lucy's Wednesday arrivals tracked it. The bad weeks she came in, with the quiet that had weight in it. The better months she came in, talking before she'd finished climbing the stool. He didn't ask for details, and she didn't provide them. The arrangement was what it had always been. The forge was a place she could be, and he was a man who would be there when she came, and that was its own kind of promise without the language of promises. Evelyn's visits to Ruth continued through the summer, And in September, Ruth Dawson joined the loose gathering of women who met at Britta Anderson's house on Tuesday afternoons, which was a significant development that Evelyn reported to Caleb one evening simply by saying, "Ruth came to Britta's today," and Caleb knowing exactly what that meant in the context of everything that had been building. "How was she?" he asked. "Quiet," Evelyn said. "But there," he nodded. "Being there was the first thing." It was a Tuesday evening in late September when Caleb came outside after the day's work and found Evelyn already on the bench. The evenings were shortening now, the light coming at a lower angle and cutting off earlier, the first real premonition of the fall in the air. The valley had started its color change, the aspens going gold, the grass going bronze, the sky doing the particular thing it did in September in Montana, where it got more blue than it had any right to be, as if compensating in advance for the gray that was coming. He sat beside her. She had the letter from her sister in her hand. She'd been writing back and forth with her sister all summer, a correspondence that had clearly been important and that he hadn't asked about beyond what she chose to share. "She wants to visit," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "In the spring, she and her husband and the children." She folded the letter. "She wants to see the place. She wants to meet you." He considered this. "She told you not to come," he said. "She did. And now she wants to visit." "People change their minds when the evidence changes," Evelyn said. "She thought I was making a desperate decision. I think she's figured out I wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes." She looked at him. "Is that all right?" He thought about a house that had been empty above a forge for 11 years, about 4 matching cups on a shelf, about a room with a good bed frame and a proper rug and a small iron hook on the back of the door. "Yes," he said. "Tell her to come." She nodded. They sat in the September light and watched the valley do its autumn thing, and the forge was behind them, and the street was in front of them, and Caleb Whitmore did not wait for anything bad to happen. He simply sat there, with the particular attention of a man who has finally decided that the present moment is worth inhabiting rather than guarding against. It was not a perfect life. It was not a resolved life, in the way that stories about lives suggested lives could be resolved, with all the problems addressed, all the rough edges filed smooth, all the complicated people made simple. Jim Dawson was still Jim Dawson. Victor Hale still rode through town with his bearing. The scar still pulled the corner of Caleb's mouth in a way that made strangers look twice. The winters were still serious, and the valley was still remote, and the work was still hard, and the world was still the world. But Evelyn was beside him, and Lucy would come Wednesday with her hands clean and climb her stool and ask questions that cut to the center of things. And the forge would be warm, and the work would be real, and the town outside, whatever it was something he was part of rather than adjacent to. That was what had changed, not the scar, not the history, not the man, the believing. For 11 years, Caleb Whitmore had lived inside the story that Raven Creek told about him. The broken man, the damaged one, the cautionary illustration of what fire could do. He had not agreed with the story. He had simply, over time, stopped arguing with it, which was a different kind of acceptance and a more corrosive one. It had taken a woman from Boston who answered a newspaper advertisement because it was honest, and a 7-year-old girl who showed her hands at the door, and a carpenter who owed a debt, and a man who said good morning until it was just something he did. It had taken all of that, gradually and imperfectly, to replace the story with something closer to the truth. The truth was not that Caleb Whitmore was a hero. The truth was not that he was broken, either. The truth was that he was a man, flawed, scarred, better at iron than at words, better at carrying things than at setting them down, prone to expecting the worst and quietly devastated when something good arrived instead, who had done his work and lived his life and deserved, as all such men deserve, to be seen clearly. Evelyn had seen him clearly from the beginning, and in being seen he had started, slowly and with considerable resistance, to see himself. This was not a transformation, it was something smaller and more durable. It was the difference between a man who endures and a man who inhabits, between a life that is survived and a life that is lived. He was learning the difference. He would be learning it for a long time still. That was all right. The September light came low and golden across the valley, and the aspens along the ridge were the color of old fire, and inside the forge on the back shelf, the iron horse, and the iron dog stood beside the space where the iron bird usually lived before Lucy carried it home. And on the kitchen table, the blue-gray cloth was worn at one corner from regular use, and 4 cups sat on the shelf above the hearth. And Caleb Whitmore sat outside his forge in the last good light of a September evening and did not wait for anything to take it from him. He just let it be what it was. He just let it